3. Hashtag Jack. A bloody mess. A crimson stream of blood flowed down Jack's cheek, past a drunken grin on his face, turning left onto the crest of his black t-shirt, and finally stopping, in small red pools, on the white sheets of the hospital bed. A sour smell of alcohol lingered in the air. The room swayed a little, moving to and fro like a boat at sea, sloshing around in the countless vodka and Red Bulls Jack had drunk throughout the evening. It wasn't how the grand public launch of Twitter was supposed to end up. Jack in the hospital at around 2 a.m., covered in blood, and Noah, Ray, and a few others still dancing at a rave a few blocks away. But in hindsight, it was as predictable as nightfall that the public debut of this tiny social startup would end this way. It had all begun before Noah had been fired from Twitter. One evening, while out drinking and dancing, Jack and Noah tried to explain Twitter to a DJ friend of Crystal's. It can be used in clubs for finding out what your friends are up to or what they're listening to. It was great at Coachella, they said while sipping sake in a dark San Francisco bar. "Oh, you guys should totally launch at the Love Parade in September," the friend replied, excited by his own epiphany. "I'm throwing a party there and you can set up a booth." Although Noah and Jack had been planning to attend Love Parade, the burgeoning techno music festival that would soon land in San Francisco, Jack was skeptical of the idea, doubting whether the rave was the right venue to use as bait for luring the non-tech public to Twitter. "This is why we built this thing," Noah told Jack before he was let go from the company. "For concerts and music shows." And as he noted, what better place to launch it than the biggest rave in San Francisco? It was the summer of 2006, and Twitter was just a speck of dust at the time, a small town in a big city of bigger startups. Barely 4,500 people had signed up for the site, since Noah had first announced it a few months earlier at the hoedown, a smaller portion of whom were actually tweeting on a daily basis. It was a bare-bones operation, too, still a vestige of Audio, which had been reduced to a half a dozen employees. Although it wasn't an official company yet, Twitter had been growing slowly over the summer with a lot of firsts. There was the first tweet of a car crash. A blogger announced that he had been fired from his job. In August, Ev tweeted that he had asked Sarah to marry him, and there was a lot of egotistical banter among the Twitterers. People had been sharing their lunches, dinners, and breakfasts, cappuccinos, sake, and wine. Uncouth first tweets about sex, masturbation, bathroom schedules, drunk epiphanies, and several other topics flew out of people's phones and into plain sight. But still, this repartee hadn't moved beyond the tech nerds. So Jack followed through on Noah's suggestion and decided the Love Parade would be the perfect venue to bring awareness of Twitter to the music-loving mainstream. The group quickly set to work. Ray, the young designer from Audio, who had been spared in the layoffs, made a flyer that they would hand out to the ravers providing instructions on how to sign up for Twitter. Jeremy and Blaine prepared the servers, ensuring that the site could handle the flood of new sign-ups. On the day of the event, Jack procured a large folding picnic table that he set up near the entrance of the Bill Graham Civic Auditorium, home of the main Love Parade dance party. As night started to fall, Ray, who had donned a black top hat with his white t-shirt for the occasion, hooked up his laptop to a pathetically dim projector that would show people's tweets using a little animated character called Selly. Jack rushed back and forth to a liquor store around the corner to buy cheap bottles of vodka and plastic cups. Although Noah no longer worked for Twitter, or even what was left of Audio, he was still friendly with some of his former co-workers and was happy to help in any way he could. But on that night, he was there more for the rave than for Twitter, and dressed appropriately, looking as if he had just walked out of a haunted house, wearing pink bands around his wrists and neck and painted black stripes across his lips. When everything was almost set and ready to go, Jack pulled his phone out of his pocket and tweeted, "At the Love Parade after party, setting up the Twitter booth." The plan was to give out free drinks, along with the Twitter flyers, to get people to sign up for service. Their first tweets would be proclamations that Massive Attack, Junkie XL, and DJ Shadow were currently playing music at the Love Parade. Exactly what Twitter was originally designed for. But the idea soon turned into a disaster. Strangely dressed and half-naked ravers, many tripping on various drugs, mushrooms, ecstasy, acid, twirled by the Twitter booth, grabbing free drink concoctions that Jack mixed in exchange for a Twitter flyer being thrust into their hand. But that was about as far as the transaction went. The few people wearing enough clothes to actually put the flyer somewhere likely lost it during the night. The flyers given to others, some wearing nothing more than underwear and large platform boots that raised them off the ground nearly a foot, ended up scrunching to tiny meteors on the floor of the theater. Every time Jack looked up at the computer to see how many new people had started tweeting, he saw barely a trickle of sign-ups. The evening wasn't going as planned. Still, he continued to mix drinks, hand out flyers, and check the screen. While Jack played bartender, a raver wandered over to Ray's computer, dancing and watching the animation of Twitter on the projector, then bumped into the table and accidentally poured an entire cocktail onto the computer's keyboard. Fade to black. The computer was dead. Ray was distraught, and after friends tried to console him, he wandered outside to cool off, only to find that his brand new bicycle had been stolen. Then things went from bad to worse to fucking terrible. Jack had spent most of the day running around setting up the grand Twitter unveiling, and as he'd been doing all of this on his own, he had been exhausted and flustered. To calm his nerves, he had downed one vodka and Red Bull after another. Later in the evening, when Jeremy arrived to help hand out flyers, Jack was so drunk he was wobbling. As the last of the leaflets were thrust into people's hands, the vodka bottles now pouring out mere drops of liquid, Jack and his merry group of ravers moved inside the theater. A solid day's work complete, they danced to the repetitive beats of techno, their arms reaching toward the sky, hoping to touch the laser lights that melted like drunken stars in the air above them. More vodka, more Red Bull, the digital music sounding like a tempo for each drink. Jack was more drunk than he had been moments earlier, more drunk than he had ever been before in his life. As they danced, a girl walked up with sloshed excitement and placed her arm around Jack. Disoriented, he threw his arm around her in response. And just like that, they both came tumbling down to the ground, Jack cracking his head on the concrete floor as he gave a drunken bow. When he finally got up, blood was pouring from his brow. He laughed as everyone stared at him, their mouths agape. His co-workers had never seen Jack let go like that before. He beamed as Ray snapped a quick picture of the blood streaming down his cheeks. Noah, who was also wasted beyond comprehension, immediately came running over. "Lay down. You have to lay down," he yelled at Jack in a slight panic. "You might have damaged your head." He rushed off to get a medic. In a matter of minutes, Jack was placed in a neck brace on a stretcher and rushed out of the theater, into an ambulance, and off to the hospital. Red lights flashed on the windows like the laser lights on the walls at the rave a few minutes earlier. It might have turned out differently if a more seasoned manager had supervised the grand unveiling of Twitter, but instead it had just been Jack, Ray, and a couple of other very junior employees. Biz was not a fan of techno music, so had chosen to stay at home in Berkeley with Livy and their rescue pets. They were also completely broke, as credit card debt had started to pile up again, forcing them to break into a coffee can piggy bank they used to collect change. Florian was in Germany, held back by delays with his work visa. Krista was at a wedding, dressed as a bridesmaid with flowers in her hands. Most of the other employees who had originally been hired to work at Audio had since been laid off. Ed was finally taking some time off from work and had set off with Sarah on vacation. And Twitter wasn't top of mind for him. He was in the process of offloading some of his remaining Google stock so he could buy out the Audio investors. The prospect of sale to MySpace or Real Networks, two of the companies interested in buying Audio, had gone from freeways to dead-end streets. In the end, they've opted to buy the startup back from the investors with millions of the dollars he had made from the sale of Blogger, mostly with the hope of preserving his name. Earlier in the month, at a web conference, he had publicly admitted that Audio had been a terrible mistake and said that he had been lured into the podcasting company by outside forces that would boost his self-image, including an offer to give a talk at TED, one of the world's premier technology conferences, and a temptation of being included in a front-page business article in the New York Times. I got sucked in for numerous reasons, including my own ego, as I had written in a blog post. But as he noted, He wasn't buying Audiobook to spin off Twitter. Instead, he planned to begin a startup incubator called Obvious Corporation, an idea factory for someone with too many ideas. He didn't want investment money, he said, because he believed that in such a setting, where he was throwing sloppy ideas against a wall, investors would only get in the way. It may be stupid, it may be naive, it may be selfish and undisciplined, and, frankly, it may not work, Ev wrote on his blog. All I know is I'm more excited about work than I've been in a long time, and from excitement and bold moves, great things often happen. But such excitement diverted his attention from something that was already on its way to greatness, which left young Jack Dorsey, with no management experience or leadership skills, in charge of Twitter. The same Jack Dorsey who was now lying on a hospital bed, getting 5 stitches across his right eyebrow as blood flowed down his face onto the white hospital sheets. As the clock neared 2 a.m., Jack emerged from the emergency room doors onto the sleeping streets of San Francisco, his head throbbing. Although the alcohol had now started to wear off, the caffeine in the Red Bull had not, and he was wide awake, his adrenalized heart pounding. So he wandered back to the Bill Graham Civic Auditorium in a daze and walked back inside, past the slapdash Twitter booth he had set up earlier in the day. Crystal had since arrived at the show, shedding her bridesmaid dress for an almost naked outfit of raver clothes. "What the hell happened to you?" she said to Jack as everyone rushed over to hug him. Jack started to offer his version of the story. Then Noah jumped in with his view of the events. Before long, they were quarreling about where, why, and how Jack had fallen. Boys, enough," Crystal said, interrupting them both. "You're bickering over the same little details." Eventually, everyone packed up, beaten, bruised, achy, and still drunk, and called a night. The grand launch of Twitter had been a flop. On Monday morning, Jack's head still hurt from the weekend as everyone sat around in the office talking about the disastrous evening. "So, how many new users did we get?" Biz asked, after hearing about Ray's computer being ruined, about the failed bartending, and about Jack's head being stitched up. "Let me check," Jack said, twirling around his chair and logging onto the servers, his fingers dancing on the keyboard. After a few moments, he twirled back around as Ray, Jeremy, and Biz stood there smiling. "Less than 100, Jack said, a defeated look on his face. "Less than 100 new users." Chaos again. The sound of fire crackled just outside the tent. Biz and Jason Goldman, the astrophysics major who had dropped out of college and joined Blogger in 2002, were sharing as they lay in their sleeping bags giggling like teenagers. They had been up for hours chatting and telling jokes as everyone else lay sleeping in their tents nearby. Then Goldman interrupted Biz and asked a question that had been on his mind for weeks. "What's the deal with Twitter?" Goldman said, "I really want to work there." Biz fell silent for a moment. It was a Saturday evening, and Ev and Sarah had organized another camping trip to Big Sur amid the giant redwood trees on the central coast of California. Goldman, just like Biz a year earlier, yearned to work with Ev again. It wasn't just that they enjoyed being around their friend, but also that Ev was an entirely different kind of boss to work for, always giving people creative freedom to explore ideas. At Google, where they had both worked, ideas were put on spreadsheets and crunched with numbers to see if they were really worth exploring. This wasn't the first time Goldman had expressed interest in working at Twitter. He had made his request in May during a last-minute trip to Las Vegas with Ev and a group of friends that had included enough partying to see the sun rise over the Nevada desert. He had asked Ev and Biz a couple of times at social fairs in San Francisco. Now, he was trying again in a tent. "Twitter is kind of Jack's thing right now," Biz said, "but you should talk to Ev in the morning and ask him." The following day, they awoke late, and Ev and Goldman stood stirring scrambled tofu on the camping stove. Biz was lying on a bright multicolored beanbag that they had stolen from Google's office. Goldman tried his question again, but the response wasn't what he wanted to hear. "You'll have to come in and spend some time with Jack, and we'll see," he said. So Goldman did just that and started wooing Jack, stopping by the Twitter offices to talk his way into the company. But Jack said he wasn't in a position to hire anyone either. "It's really up to Ev," he told him. "You'll have to talk to him." As Goldman soon learned, this runaround was typical for Twitter. When an engineer asked someone a question, or when there was an SMS contract to be signed, or when someone like Goldman was trying to get a job, the decision-making process was like a carnival. After Noah had finally and officially left the company, the power vacuum had not been resolved as if it hoped. Rather, it had spun into another orbit. No one to make a decision. No one to revoke the few bad decisions that had been made. Having successfully returned the audio investors $5 million from his Google earnings, Ev's mind was elsewhere, focusing on Obvious Corporation and sifting through his ideas. He was still involved in Twitter and was a sole investor, having allocated $1 million of his own money to nurture the company, though he was trying to leave Jack and Biz to run the operation. But it wasn't much of an enterprise yet. The site was growing slowly, with only a few thousand sign-ups. Goldman, like everyone who already worked at Twitter, was enamored with the idea as soon as he heard it and wanted to work there. Eventually, after months of negotiations, Ev agreed to hire Goldman, albeit with caveat. He would be part-time at Obvious and part-time at Twitter, a hybrid Twitter employee without a completely defined role. Goldman had been in a similar situation with Ev before, 5 years earlier in 2002, when he first joined Blogger as a part-time employee before it was sold to Google. Goldman's job at Blogger had been a mishmash of stuff. In addition to answering support emails complaining about the outlandish content on Blogger, he'd fixed the dripping sink, searched for a new office, managed the accounting, and helped out with the paperwork for the Google acquisition. 5 years later, in February 2007, on his first day at Twitter, it was apparent this job description would be almost exactly the same, a little bit of everything. And again, a lot of confusion. Although Jack had taken a lead at Twitter, it was clear that no one was actually in charge. Companies often take on the traits of their founders and first employees. So Twitter, which was nurtured out of audio, a seedling from Noah's chaotic brain, was still operating as an anarchist hacker collective with no rules. Many of the employees did what they wanted, where they wanted. That was, if they wanted to do anything related to their daily job at all. Rather than fix the servers, people built their own little trinkets and apps that fed into Twitter. Jack had no luck taming them. There was also a tremendous amount of rivalry between him and his co-workers as, just a few months earlier, when audio still existed, Jack had been working below all of them. Goldman was immediately caught up in the lure of the flies, like power vacuum. Technically, he reported to Jack while on Twitter, but he was also reporting to Ev on Obvious and was possibly Jack's superior, as Obvious technically owned Twitter. Still, just as in his early days at Blogger, Goldman dove into his new mishmash job and tried to institute a sense of order amid the chaos. One of his first tasks was to work with Jack to help make Twitter friendlier for newcomers to understand. The service allowed people to perform actions through text messages with the ability to do things like follow or unfollow others. But there were other verbs that were puzzling to people on the site and needed to be coded. So the cutting began. Worship, ensure that people received every single update from someone they followed. Sleep, allow people to pause updates they received. And a long list of other options were nixed. There were, of course, much bigger problems in the question of which verbs to use on Twitter. Since the site had been built as a prototype in 2 weeks using a relatively new programming language called Ruby on Rails, it was rife with shortcuts and code problems. It was as if someone had rushed to build a skyscraper and in the time crunch had chosen to put together the structure with cardboard, glue, and tape rather than nails, wood, and concrete. Worse, people were now moving into the building before construction crews could replace the flimsy materials with real ones. And then there was the biggest problem of them all, trying to explain to people what Twitter actually was. Everyone had a different answer. It's a social network. It replaces text messages. It's the new email. It's microblogging. It's to update your status. As a result, most newcomers didn't understand what to do when they first arrived on the site. People would sign up and send their first tweet, which often looked like one of the following missives. How do I use this? What the fuck is this thing? Twitter is stupid. This is dumb. The confusion led to one of the first topics that Jack and Ev saw differently. Jack saw Twitter as a place to say what I'm doing. Ev saw it as more like a mini blogging product. Both of them thought the way people had used it during a mini earthquake the previous summer held clues to what Twitter could be. It was just after 8 o'clock one night in late August 2006 when Jack's phone vibrated on his office desk. He reached over and saw a text message from Twitter sent by Ev and started to read. Did anyone just feel that hurt? But before he came to the end of the message, he felt his chair shake a little. He looked up and away from his phone and saw the plant on his desk waving at him, its leaves swaying in the air like someone calling to a friend. Huh, Jack said as his desk briefly quivered like setting jello. Did you feel that? He asked as he turned to a few others in the office. Before they could answer, his phone vibrated again. He looked down and continued to read Ev's original message. Did anyone just feel that earthquake? Then the next tweet from someone else. Wondering if I just felt an earthquake. As a pop of adrenaline kicked in, Jack quickly typed, just felt that earthquake. No one else here did. At the moment he hit send, a string of other messages started streaming into his phone, like letters falling through a mail slot to the floor. Ack earthquake, wrote one friend. Yep, felt the quake, wrote another. Then a handful of other earthquake tweets. I felt the earthquake, but Livy didn't believe me until the Twitters started rolling in, wrote Biz. Finally, another person announced that it was a 4.72 magnitude jolt. The quake didn't cause any damage, except for some frayed nerves and a few crooked pictures now hanging on the walls. But for the small group of people who had experienced the event on Twitter, it felt strangely different. On the day of that small earthquake, only a few hundred people were using the service. Of the 15,000 tweets sent across the network up to that point, almost all had still been focused on the original concept. What's your status? A question that often invited a narcissistic response. Sharing the quake on Twitter had been a moment that was about the status of something bigger than each individual. Although the people on the site were all in completely different locations, time and space had briefly compressed. It was as if someone had pulled the end of a hanging thread on a sweater, forcing the fabric to scrunch up closer together. Or as Noah had originally foreseen, months before anyone else, Twitter had been used to help people feel less alone. For Ev, it was another clue in a theory he was developing about Twitter's role as a way to share news, not just status. Twitter as a communication network, not just a social network. He told Jack about the concept of Twitter as a news network, but Jack disagreed, instead seeing the earthquake tweets as an example of the speed of Twitter. He focused on his phone vibrating a few brief seconds before his desk had become a puppet without a puppeteer. Jack had continued to see Twitter as a way to talk about what was happening to him. Ev was starting to see it as a view into what was happening in the world. While these little news-like events went mostly unnoticed by the public, philosophically Jack and Ev were developing different viewpoints as to what Twitter was and what it had the potential to be. And the winner is... It was early evening on Sunday, March 11th, 2007, as Frank, a comedian and actor, looked out at the sea of heads bowed over the soft glow of phones. He continued talking as he paced across the open stage. His boyish blonde hair bounced with each step in unison with the orange balloons in the background behind him. He would try to add anticipation as he spoke, announcing the list of contestants for Best Startup in the blog category at South by Southwest, the annual technology conference in Austin, Texas. That is the closest thing nerds have to the Oscars. Superfluous banter, he said, among a list of other finalists, then after a slight pause. And Twitter, the packed auditorium began whistling and clapping, a very different reception from the launch of Twitter at the Love Parade 5 months earlier. Jack turned to look at the people around him, almost in disbelief, and smiled as everyone cheered. Ev scanned the room too, taking a sip of the red wine in the short plastic cup in his hand, and then leaned over to Jack, whispering to him that if Twitter won, he should give the acceptance speech. Jack was thrilled, but having barely spoken as a child, he wasn't confident about talking in front of large crowds. He turned to Biz to share the good or bad news. What should I say? Jack asked him. Biz stared off into space for a second and then said, I got it. He grabbed a pencil and a piece of paper and scribbled down a short speech that he then handed to Jack. Noah, now the outcast of Twitter, was seated next to the group and held a video camera, taping what was about to happen. He whistled and hooped as the word Twitter echoed throughout the room. Noah had come to South by Southwest to explore other startup ideas he was thinking of building alone, and had bumped into his former co-workers and best friends outside the theater. After chatting about the mundane and about the extraordinary rate at which people had been signing up for Twitter the conference, Ev had made a peace offering. Hey, Noah, would you like to sit with us? Ev had asked. It had been a rough few months for Noah, as he had recently written in a very personal blog post explaining that 2006 had been the hardest year of his life. I lost more than I knew I could. I lost my two best friends. Changed my definition of self. He wrote on his website. I left my company and everything I spent years creating. I learned about stress, about trust, about sadness. I cried more tears than I ever have. Now, as he was picking himself back up, Ev was holding out a hand. Sure, that'd be great, Noah had said to him. I'd like that. As they sat in the audience together listening to Zay Frank, the Twitter guys were all excited, but they were also completely exhausted from the past few days. Ev had been to South by Southwest several times before, and he knew the way people crowded in the hallways between conference sessions to chatter with friends. So months earlier, he had suggested an idea. Why don't we put a flat panel with a cool Twitter screen in the main hallway where people hang out? Ev had written in an email to Jack and Biz in the weeks leading up to the conference. On that, put the Twitters from people who were at the conference. He noted that it would be highly compelling to see all these updates with pictures from people all around you. Biz and Jack had been immediately sold on the idea and corralled the troops to get to work. The team at Twitter was still very small, just a handful of engineers and designers, but Blaine and Jeremy had started on the servers. Ray, who had done something similar for the disastrous Twitter Love Parade unveiling, had built a flash animation that could be set up on 51-inch plasma displays. A few days before the conference began, Biz and Jack had flown out to set up the screens throughout the halls. In the background of each display, a large beige Twitter logo hung in the air, surrounded by instructions telling people how to tweet what they were doing. Attendees loved seeing their names, faces, and commentary stream across the screens for all to view. It didn't take long for the plasma displays to become digital billboards, with people huddled around to see which talk or panel to attend as pithy updates scrolled down. The Apple iPhone would not go on sale for another 3 months, so the act of peering down at a cell phone for hours on and wasn't part of the social vernacular yet, even at a technology conference. Most people, like Jack, had a Motorola Razr, which was a slim phone that flipped open to offer an extensive menu of features, sending text messages or making phone calls. Since Twitter worked via text message, people with all types of cell phones could use the service, and it started to spread quickly among the conference attendees. As people sat in panel discussions, rather than look up at those speaking, they instead peered longingly at their phones, staring patiently while they waited for an update, hoping to find some snippet of information more important than real life. As usage of the site started to spread, investors who were at the conference in search of the next big thing soon found out about Twitter. One young investor, Charlie O'Donnell, a shorter man with a head as bald as Mr. Clean's, was standing on an escalator on Friday afternoon talking to a friend and couldn't believe what he was witnessing. This is fucking crazy, Charlie said as he wandered to the conference halls, peering from side to side at everyone glued to their phones, constantly pecking for new updates. Everyone here is on Twitter, he said. I've got to tell Fred, Charlie added as he pulled out his phone to email his old boss, Fred Wilson, who was a partner at Union Square Ventures, a well-known investment firm in New York City. Do you Twitter? He asked Fred in the email. You should check it out. I didn't get it at first, but now that there's a group going to South by Southwest, I get it, Charlie wrote. I'd never text all the people I'm texting now, but it's a really seamless way to text groups and individuals at the same time. Fred wasn't convinced, telling Charlie that such a service would never work, and that other companies that had tried to make Twitter-like products had all failed. Yet by Monday morning, Twitter was gaining such popularity at the conference, and thus receiving so much attention on the tech blogs, that Fred changed his tune. As he sat sipping coffee, his short, dark hair still scruffy in the early morning, he went to twitter.com and registered his name. Trying Twitter, he wrote, sending his first tweet. Fred was 45 years old at the time, already a legend in the investing circles after having sold GeoCities to Yahoo for $3.57 billion in stock in 1999. He had also gained a reputation for making adept predictions about new internet services or themes. Now here he was, watching a stream of tweets fill his screen. Some of the messages talked about the conference, others mentioned Austin, and of course people complained about their hangovers from the night before. At South by Southwest, one of the main pastimes of attendees is a treasure hunt for the biggest buckets of free liquor. After a few days, Twitter had become the equivalent of a decoder ring in a cereal box to find such a bounty. On several occasions, Jack, Biz, Ev, and Goldman were sitting in a packed bar, sipping beers and reeling from the day, when all of a sudden people's cell phones would start dinging with text messages. Like clones, people would look down at their tiny 2-inch screens, read a tweet about a new party, then one by one grab their coats and trickle out of the bar, off to the next alcohol-soaked gathering with Twitter guiding their way. Soon bloggers at the conference were referring to the mass exodus from one place to the next as flocking. Back in San Francisco, Jeremy, Blaine, Ray, and the other engineers spent the weekend hunkered down at the offices, tinkering and tweaking the servers to ensure that the site stayed alive during the critical few days of the conference. When massive spikes of usage and conversation happened on Twitter, their hearts palpitated with anxiety, hoping the website could live through the influx of updates. After the launch of the Love Parade, now a distant memory they would rarely speak about again, Twitter had been growing at a healthy pace, partially because of the chatter about the service, but mostly because Ev's well-known name was attached to it. That week in Austin, the sign-ups made the last few months look like Twitter had been growing in slow motion. As Zay Frank stood on the stage preparing to announce the winner for the best new startup, the servers were about to get battered again. And the winner is... Zay Frank said into microphone as he looked down at a piece of paper, the audience quieting for a brief moment as he prepared to tell them all what they already knew. Twitter. Noah began whistling and clapping as he heard the announcement, but his happiness was diluted in a matter of seconds as Jack, Biz, Goldman, and Ev rose from their seats, squeezing past Noah as if he were just another conference attendee, and then wading through the ocean of applause and up the staircase to the stage. Jack's brown cowboy boots hit the floor as he rushed toward the microphone. Biz stood to his right holding the award in his hands. Ev and Goldman stood back, giving the spotlight to Jack as he delivered the pithy speech that Biz had written. I would like to thank everyone in 140 characters or less, Jack said to the crowd as he leaned forward into the microphone. And I just did. He waved and said, thank you, as the group walked off the stage to thunderous applause. By the time they returned to their seats, Noah was gone. Jack, Biz, Goldman, and Ev were gleeful after the announcement. They wandered the halls of the conference, holding up the rectangular glass prize they had been given, posing for photos and shaking people's hands as they made their way to an after-party. Jack was wearing a blue scarf that swirled around his neck and over his black long-sleeve t-shirt. When he arrived at the party, he was glowing and elated, like a prom queen with a crown atop her head. People continually walked up and congratulated him. Just 2 days earlier, he had arrived as a nobody. Now, he was a mini-celebrity. Noah was dismayed as he wandered the halls for a short time after the awards, but he quickly decided that rather than harbor resentment at not being invited to join his former co-workers on stage, he would be happy for his friend's new success. Off he went, trudging toward the after-party, and he soon caught a glimpse of the Twitter crew from a corner of the room. As he approached Jack, Noah reached out to shake hands, his mouth opening to offer congratulations. Yet when he was just a few feet away from his friend, Biz swooped in and placed his arm around Jack as he spun them both around and in another direction to pose for a photo. Noah was left standing there in a room full of people, his arm at a 45-degree angle, as if he were shaking hands with an invisible man. Jack, Biz, and Evan slipped off into a side room as more people asked to take their photos. Noah, devastated by what had just happened, left the party. After the festivities started to die down, Jack tweeted that the small group of founders were making their way to a diner to decompress. As they sat inside, the neon Magnolia Cafe sign glistening in the rain, snacking on chips and salsa and sipping from tall glasses of beer and water, they reeled from the excitement of winning. At Magnolia's, sopping wet, Ev tweeted. Then shortly afterward, Biz added, chowing down late night at Magnolia with the guys. But it wasn't all the guys. Just a few blocks away, Noah wandered alone in the rain as his former friends and co-founders toasted to the award they had just won without him, the first CEO. The engineers were staring into their computer screens, their headphones wrapped around their heads, as Jack, Ev, Biz, and Goldman wandered toward the back of the office and into the rear room that had once been Noah's office. No one paid them any attention. It looked just like any other meeting as they shuffled inside, each grabbing a mismatched rolling chair. Goldman slid the glass door closed behind him, giving it an extra push to make sure no one could overhear the conversation they were about to have. In the few months in South by Southwest, Twitter had quickly passed 100,000 people who had signed up for the site. There was still no revenue or even talk of a business model, but figuring that out would be the job of the CEO. After weeks of private discussions, some over coffees or beers, others via email, they were finally going to decide who would be running Twitter, what each person's title would be, and how they would split up the stock. Until this moment, the company had belonged solely to Ev, who had financed it with his personal money after buying out Noah and the previous investors almost 6 months earlier. It had been a confusing and stressful few weeks for the top half of the Twitter mast. Though they were less concerned about their monetary stakes, their titles, and in turn their egos, were paramount. In the early days of startups, titles are usually handed out without much thought or resonance. Who will be a vice president, chief technology officer, or director of X, Y, and Z is often discussed in a land of make-believe. Given that 90% of startups don't make it past their toddler years, such decisions rarely matter in the long run. At Twitter, it was no different. Although it was unlike Biz to politic for anything, he had been pushing for a more important title at Twitter for months, hoping to avoid the fate that had befallen him at his previous jobs. When he joined Blogger, it had already been acquired by Google, no fancy titles for him there. When he landed on Audio's shores, important titles had already been divided up there too. Throughout his career, he had always been in the right place at the wrong time. To ensure he didn't fall into the same trap at Twitter, he had begun campaigning with an email he'd sent to Ev and Jack a few weeks earlier. Maybe this is inappropriate, but if I don't ask, I'll never know. Biz wrote in the message after debating over a long weekend about what to say. What do you envision my title to be? Is there a chance I could be called co-founder? He knew that as the company grew, the title of co-founder would garner him more respect, both internally and externally, unlike titles like CEO, CFO, or COO, to which specific roles are attached. The title of co-founder also meant Biz could do what he wanted, moving around the company with a lot of power, but without too much responsibility. At the time, it had been assumed that Ed would be CEO of Twitter and Jack would be president or director of technology. But Biz's role had always been unclear. I don't know the answer to this yet. It is not an unreasonable request. Ev wrote back to Biz, also noting that he wasn't sold on the idea. But it might not be best for a number of reasons. The room in the rear of the office had now been nicknamed the Purse Factory by some employees after Sarah, Ev's fiancée, had moved into the office a few months earlier with the goal of making women's purses there. A few scraps of fabric hung about, some tailor scissors, a sewing machine, and although it was rarely used to make women's handbags, this had become the impromptu office for important meetings. I've decided I'm not going to be CEO, Ev told Jack, Biz, and Goldman as he leaned back in his chair. He explained that although he wanted to be involved with Twitter, offering his guidance and vision for the product, he wanted to focus on obvious corporation and continue to build new web startups from within his idea incubator. This wasn't what Goldman wanted to hear. He was hoping that Ed would run Twitter and that Jack would report up to the CEO, not be the CEO. A few days earlier, at a private lunch with Biz, Goldman had tried to convince him not to make Jack CEO, telling him he didn't think he was capable of running the company. And although he agreed, Ev believed Jack could be molded. So who was going to be CEO? Biz asked. They all looked in Jack's direction. There was no question that Jack had taken on leadership of Twitter after Noah had been pushed out, but there were questions as to whether he could pull off building a real company, especially one that was growing as fast as bacteria in a petri dish. Jack had already shown he could make deft decisions, including an email he had sent in late January. We have 4 and only 4 priorities: performance, usability, development efficiencies, and costs, he wrote. Then, offering a plan to take Twitter from a buggy website to a smooth operation, he added that the company needed to fix the servers, sort out confusing design issues on the site, and hire new engineers. Jack had also made one of the most important decisions for Twitter to date: limiting the length of tweets. Currently, the number of characters you are allowed in your update is dependent on the length of your name. He had written to his colleagues, "We're going to standardize this at 140 characters. Everyone gets the same amount of space to Twitter. No more confusion or guessing as you are typing." Until then, messages have been limited to 160 characters, which was the maximum length of a text message that could be sent from a cell phone. The move to 140 characters would allow Twitter to include someone's username in the text. Jack's next move had been to transition to usernames everywhere on the site. Jack had written in the same email, "If your name is Bob2342, your friends are going to get Bob2342, walking the dog." He added, "This should clear up massive amounts of confusion and complaints." But this was the type of thing Goldman worried about from Jack. Using usernames rather than real names was a typical engineering decision. People in the real world didn't call themselves Bob2342. They were simply Bob. Still, Ev had been impressed with Jack's leadership. "Excellent write-up, Jack. I agree with everything wholeheartedly," he'd written. Back in the purse factory, Ev looked at Jack and asked him if he thought he could be the chief of Twitter. "We can do a CEO search and find an outsider who has experience running a company," Ev said. "That would make you something like Chief Technology Officer." "No, I can do it," Jack said. "I want to do it." Goldman looked skeptical. Biz rocked on the legs of his chair. They sat silently for a few seconds, thinking about it. Jack looked at them all with a sense of yearning. "Okay, here's the deal," Ev said, pausing again. He dictated that Jack would be CEO. Biz, Jack, and Ev would be co-founders. Goldman would be the vice president of product. Biz and Jack immediately felt a sense of elation. As Ev had personally financed Twitter with his own money to date, he told the group that he would retain a 70% stake in Twitter. Jack, as CEO, would be given 20% of the company. Biz and Goldman would receive around 3% each. The rest would be split up among current engineers and new hires. Eventually, Ev explained, Twitter would need to seek venture funding from investors, which would dilute some of their stock. But as the company consisted of only a handful of engineers, that conversation could wait. As the meeting wrapped up, they slid the glass door to the office open, and Jack walked out into the office as an official boss. He was beaming with pride and excitement. The CEO of Twitter, at least for now. The $100 million offer. Blaine looked up from his desk, leaning back in his chair as Ev walked briskly by, heading toward the front door. "Hey, Ev!" Blaine yelled, his long, pin-straight hair hanging down over his shoulders. "Don't take less than $100 million. Ev smiled, nodded as if to say, "Okay," and then closed the door to 164, South Park behind him. It was mid-June 2007, and Jack, Biz, and Goldman were already outside on the curb as Ev emerged. Small pockets of fog lingered on the grass as they started to walk, turning right onto 3rd Street. Their destination was a mere 350 feet away. As their sneakers tickled the concrete sidewalk, Goldman broke the silence. "This will be interesting, if nothing else, to see what our value is," he said. "We really don't have a sense of what we're actually worth." Biz and Ev agreed. Jack was silent as he walked, deep in thought and excitement about his first acquisition meeting. They could hear car tires thumping on the grates of the freeway up the block as they approached the large gray building on the corner of 3rd and Bryant Streets, the home of Yahoo!'s offices. Although Yahoo!'s company headquarters were in Sunnyvale, 40 miles south of San Francisco, the company had recently set up this satellite office, called Brick House, as an incubator for entrepreneurial Yahooers to develop entirely new startups. The Twitter employees had all been to the office before, often for some of the company's popular Web 2.0 parties. Usually mundane affairs, beer, wine, cheese, crackers, and lots of networking. The parties were meant to celebrate the resurgence of the web after the cold winter of the early 2000s bubble pop. Most events were the same. People wandered around aimlessly, constantly peering down at the name tags stuck to everyone else's shirts, searching for a venture capitalist, a blogger, or one of the esoteric famous people who had sold their startups already. But this morning's meeting was different. There would be no cheese, beer, or name tags. Instead, Yahoo wanted to buy Twitter. They want to talk acquisition. Ev wrote in an email to Jack and Goldman at the time. Says that if our price is not hundreds of millions, but tens of millions, even several tens of millions, doesn't think it'll be a problem. Although Twitter had no revenue and no projected business model at the time, Yahoo envisioned this new startup as an extension of its mobile offerings. More than a year after it had begun as an experiment, Twitter had grown to nearly 250,000 active users. While the internal debates over who was in charge have been sorted out, at least for now, outsiders still often reached out to Ev, whom they knew and trusted from Blogger. It annoyed Jack, who was technically the CEO, to hear that someone wanted to buy the company through Ev, but he never let on. When the request to meet with Yahoo came in, Ev had been lining up meetings with 5 prospective venture capitalists and was preparing to put $500,000 of his own money into Twitter to continue funding it until the company decided who would finance it. He had also talked to angel investors who came with lots of connections and could help Twitter grow. Among them was the legendary Ron Conway, a wheeler and dealer who came with a slew of connections in Silicon Valley and access to a team of private investigators, if needed. Although lots of investors, including the big names like Fred Wilson, had started lining up with term sheets offering millions of dollars to finance the company, some investors immediately opted out, telling Ev that they didn't see a business model in 140-character updates about people's lunches. All of these discussions were put on hold when Yahoo called. Brick House was a cavernous, loft-like space. Huge white columns randomly interrupted the floor like giant linebackers standing on a football field. At one end of the room, floor-to-ceiling windows looked out on the city. At the other, a wall had been meticulously covered with thousands of fluorescent post-it notes, creating an image of a giant pixelated hand. Engineers lay about on beanbags programming on their laptops. It was a nerd's paradise. As the Twitter team wandered in, Bradley Horowitz, who ran Brick House, greeted them with some other Yahoo executives. "Hey, man," Bradley said as he patted Ev on the back, then shook his hand. "Great to see you." Bradley wore his signature dark glasses, the frames as thick as his brows. The creases in his cheeks made him look more like an army general than a computer engineer. He led them to the right, toward the conference room, where they shuffled inside, grabbing unassigned seats. As everyone got comfortable and introduced themselves, Ev began talking. He had learned how offers to buy startups work when he went through the process with Google and Blogger. It was more like trying to negotiate with a high-level escort than selling your company. In the end, it almost always came down to the highest price. Ev ran through the numbers, explaining that at the end of February, days before the company had set off for Austin, the Twitter website had been receiving about 200,000 new visitors a month. By the end of March, after the South by Southwest Award, the number of people coming to the site had quadrupled, quickly zooming past 1 million visitors as April rolled in. He explained that there was no revenue at Twitter yet, but that would come later, he said, possibly through advertising or some new kind of business model. For now, Ed was paying all the bills to keep the lights on. Jack clasped his hands together on the table, barely saying a word. He was nervous, but attempted to portray an air of confidence that didn't come across to the others in the room. He simply watched Ev walk Bradley around the Twitter garden. Then the discussion turned to what Twitter actually was. So it's a social network? Bradley asked. Silence filled the room. Almost a year into the service, there was no consistent answer to the question. Even since March, after South by Southwest, the site had continued to take on a life of its own, not just for status updates, but also for news. The technorati were clearly obsessed with the site, using it mostly to talk about themselves. But other people and companies were using it differently. Major news outlets, including the New York Times, Dow Jones, and the Defamer blog, had set up on the streets of Twitter, all sharing breaking local and gossipy news. There were now a fake Bill Clinton, Homer Simpson, and Darth Vader who posted jokey fake statuses. A few real celebrities had also joined. Janina Gavankar, an actress in the L Word, had been the first celebrity to start tweeting, although Biz had spent a few hours trying to figure out if she was real or an imposter. John Edwards, the presidential candidate, sent messages from his campaign trail. There were also things on Twitter. Fire departments had joined, police scanners, baseball games, food trucks. Yet even with this flood of distinctive use cases, no one in the press really seemed to understand what Twitter was. Some in the media had taken to calling it hipster narcissism, self-absorption, self-obsession, egotistical, and more than a few people had tried Twitter called a complete and utter fucking waste of time. But the question made Jack pipe up for the first time and start speaking, referencing a blog post written by Fred Wilson in late April. What exact role is Twitter going to play? Fred had asked in the post, discussing its place in the future of the web. It will be the status broadcasting system of the internet. I see Twitter as a utility, Jack said, a broadcasting system for the internet. Then he began to describe his vision for Twitter, noting that it was like electricity. All of this confused Bradley, who looked around the room, perplexed by the idea of a social media company as a utility. As the meeting came to a close, they all shook hands, and Bradley walked everyone out. He thanked them for coming, then looked over at Ev and said, "We'll be in touch soon." As they plodded back toward 164 South Park, Ev spoke up. "What did you guys think?" he asked. There was a certain air of excitement from the meeting. "I like Brick House," Biz said as they wandered back. "It seems like it'd be a fun place to work." "Me too," Goldman said. "So what's the lowest price we sell for?" Goldman asked. 100 million? Ev hazarded. Biz and Goldman would each get about $2 to $3 million if a sale went through at that price. Although such a number is like winning the lottery for most of the world's population, $1 million in Valley terms is like finding a quarter between your couch cushions. Such a number would give Ev more money and leverage to continuing putting startups on the obvious corporation conveyor belt. Given Twitter's growth and attention, though, Ed was thinking about pausing his idea incubator and focusing on the 140-character machine. Prior to the Yahoo meeting, in an email to Goldman and Biz, he had noted that he was prepared to double down on Twitter, pushing obvious corporation to the side. That still left the question of what to do next, whether take money from an outside investor or try to sell Twitter to Yahoo or a similar suitor. Jack didn't have the confidence or the power within the company to make that type of decision, so he quietly looked to Ev for guidance. Jack had the most to win from a sale. Although he was making $70,000 a year, he was still flat broke, living paycheck to paycheck, paying off credit card debt and student loans from a year of college at New York University before dropping out years earlier. A sale for $100 million would give him $20 million, a gargantuan sum that could change his life forever. Maybe we would take $80 million? Jack asked. $80 million is the absolute lowest. Goldman said as they pulled the door open, walking back into the offices. They didn't have to wait long to find out the real number. In the late afternoon, Ev got a call from Bradley. They spoke for a few minutes, then hung up. "Hey," Ev said to Jack as he walked over to his desk. "Let's talk outside." Goldman followed them. "So," Goldman asked as they stood on the sidewalk. "What's the number?" 12. Ev said bluntly, his arms folded as he toed the edge of the sidewalk with his sneaker. "What's 12? Goldman asked now slightly confused. Jack started to giggle. "They offered us 12, Ev said, his voice pitched higher with slight disbelief. $12 million? Goldman asked, his eyes widening slightly when he said the number aloud to himself. "Yep," Ev said, $12 million. They weren't upset by the offer, as investors were begging to fund the company, but they did think it was comical that Yahoo would offer such a low number. "We should really take the deal," Jack said sarcastically as they all laughed. The comical tone was interrupted as Ev told them what Bradley had said on the phone, that he believed Yahoo could easily build the technology behind Twitter, that it was simply just a messaging service, and a few engineers could do the same thing in a week. He had concluded that if Twitter didn't sell, Yahoo planned to build and release a competitor. It was a typical relationship offer in the Valley. Either you fuck us or we'll fuck you. But hearing such an offer, followed by the fearful threat of attack by a much bigger company like Yahoo, was also a relief. Now that they knew they weren't going to sell Twitter, they had a clear path. They could move forward and raise their first real round of venture capital. Money they needed right away to expand the servers and hire engineers to help with the company's growth. Before the Yahoo meeting, they had already decided that their first choice for investment would be Fred Wilson. This was partially because Ev and Jack believed Fred understood what Twitter could be. But more important, Fred didn't care about a business model and wouldn't pressure the founders of Twitter to come up with one. That, he told them, would come later. As Goldman, Jack, and Ev walked back into the office, there was a rare esprit de corps among them. In a single day, they had almost sold their company, then found out the suitor was now coming after them. Although they didn't know it yet, it was one of the few moments they would agree on a direction for Twitter. By the end of the coming summer, it would no longer be Twitter versus its competitors. It would be Twitter versus itself, Jack on one side, Ev on the other. 12 million. Goldman asked again as the door closed behind them. "Yep," Ev said, laughing. $12 million. Is Twitter down? The blog post appeared on the Twitter website at 11:53 a.m. on Thursday, July 26. First, Twitter was a fun side project. Then it was careful, lovingly obvious until it was time to form Twitter, Inc. Jack wrote in the blog post, "Today, we're excited to announce an important moment for Twitter. We've raised funding from our friends in New York City at Union Square Ventures. Fred Wilson, a partner at Union Square, will be leading a $5 million round of funding that would value Twitter at just over $20 million. Then in a separate blog post, Fred explained why his firm was investing in a company with no income. The question everyone asks is, what is the business model? To be completely and totally honest, we don't yet know. Fred wrote on Union Square's website, "The capital we are investing will go to making Twitter a better, more reliable and robust service. That's what the focus needs to be right now. Revenue would have to come later." Fred was right. There was no time to worry about business models while Twitter was in its current state, broken. Each morning had been the same for the Twitter employees. A scene of Jeremy's wife finding him on the couch at home in the same position as the night before, his laptop still glowing a warm blue haze on his chest, a small waterfall of drool coursing down the side of his cheek, his fingers lying on the keyboard as if he had been shot in a break-in gone awry. Blaine was found in the same position at his apartment. They had both been working through the night, trying to keep Twitter up and running, but often to no avail. The website was continually breaking, and nothing could be done to stop the outages. Because of the way the site had been built, hacked together over 2 weeks, the influx of people on Twitter was making it fall apart. It wasn't just one aspect of the service that was breaking. It was every aspect of it. Posts weren't showing up in the timeline. Accounts were disappearing. The site was offline for hours or sometimes more than a day at a time. The servers were collapsing. And because everything was in such disarray, the employees were revolting. Twitter had been built as a small rowboat designed to carry a few people across a pond. Now the same vessel was being used to carry the same number of passengers as a cruise ship across an ocean. As a result, it was sinking. The outages also had a domino effect. with a failure of one aspect of the site knocking down everything else. The third-party tools Twitter gave to developers were being harnessed by hundreds of companies and apps that used Twitter's content. This influx of applications was straining resources away from the website. The site itself, which was still stuck together with the digital equivalent of plastic wrap and scotch tape, would often bring down the servers. The servers would get clogged up with all the tweets waiting to be sent to the website, and, bringing it back around to beginning, the third-party tools would stop working. Almost daily, the entire operation would just come to a halt. Although the site's problems should have slowed the flood of people signing up, they were only making it worse, adding bad press that would pique more curiosity about this Twitter thing. If everyone else is signing up and breaking it, then surely I should see what this thing is about. A pile-on of hundreds of thousands of people on one tiny little company. When the site reached one of its daily snapping points, the biggest problem was that the engineers had no idea where the breakage had originated. To solve this problem, or at least try, Jeremy and Blaine built code into the servers that would notify them via text message and email when the site was suffering from one of its many issues, like a patient put on life support, tubes and wires and cords sticking out and beeping about his health. The new code was designed to help engineers determine where the patient had fallen ill. Then they could go in and operate. This worked for a short while, but as they soon found out, the road to chaos can be paved with good intentions. In a matter of days, the notifier was sounding a series of alarms that couldn't be turned off, and the engineering team was inundated with bulletins. Their phones woke them in the middle of the night, sometimes every few hours, other times every few seconds, vibrating, ringing, and buzzing on the nightstand, with Twitter begging for help as it had flatlined again. On several occasions, the problems were so severe that Jeremy and Blaine woke up to find more than 1,000 text messages from Twitter servers complaining about a problem that had shuttered the site. People who used Twitter were complaining as much as the servers. In one instance, a group of Twitter's faithful users decided to hold an online boycott. They proclaimed, on Twitter of course, that they would snub the service for 24 hours to show their disdain for the free site going offline all the time. On the same day, after reading about the boycott, another group of Twitter supporters decided to send free pizzas to 164, South Park, to show their love of the service. But no amount of pizza could fix Twitter. It had been born broken. As things worsened, Biz took to the company's blog to address the situation. Twitter is slow. We are painfully aware, he wrote on the site in a post appropriately titled, The Tortoise and the Twitter. The slowness is being caused by massive popularity, which makes for a bittersweet type of situation. We thought we'd let you know what we're doing to make things more sweet than bitter. Its slowness didn't stop Twitter's growth. People kept signing up. The press kept coming, some good, some bad. The site kept growing. Every 2 weeks, the number of people joining Twitter doubled. And as the Financial Times noted in a story on the front page of its print paper, the mini-blog is the talk of Silicon Valley. There was a Business Week profile. Twitter was referenced in Time magazine as one of the top 50 new websites. Broadcast where you are and what you're doing right here and right now by texting from your mobile phone, the article said. Mainstream newspapers, television stations, and non-tech blogs were picking up the story. Even though the site was not ready for its moment on the stage, it was getting it. Twitter employees were so busy trying to keep the site alive that they were stripping things out of the site rather than adding new ones. As this all happened, some of the loyal tech nerds on the service decided to take the lack of new features into their own hands, and 2 new strange characters started to appear regularly in people's Twitter stream. The symbols @N hashtag, in programming speak, that was used by engineers to talk to other people on a server, so it was natural that it would transfer over to Twitter. The first use of the @symbol was by a young Apple designer, Robert Anderson, who on November 2nd, 2006, replied to his brother by placing an @ before his name as they talked. The symbol started to slowly steep into the vernacular of Twitter. Before long, people were referencing one another not by their first names, but by their Twitter @names. The new communication method grew so popular on the site that in early May, Alex Payne, a Twitter programmer, added a new tab to the Twitter website that showed people's @replies. Then there was a hashtag, the pound symbol that until then had primarily been used on telephones while checking an answering machine. On Flickr, the photo sharing site, people sometimes use a hashtag symbol to group similar images. In one instance, people had been using Flickr to share pictures of forest fires in San Diego, California, and had started to organize the newsy pictures with a tag that read, hashtag San Diego Fire. Chris Messina, a designer who lived in the Valley and was friends with many of the Twitter employees, started using the same symbol on Twitter, and before long it was picked up by others on the site. One day, Chris decided to stop by the offices to pitch a more formal usage of this strange-looking hashtag icon. He wandered inside, and on the stairs bumped into Ev and Biz, who were on their way out to grab lunch. I really think you should do something with hashtags on Twitter, Chris told them. Hashtags are for nerds, Biz replied. Ev added that they were too harsh and no one is ever going to understand them. Chris argued otherwise, pointing out that people were actively using them now and that they could connect conversations on Twitter with chatter taking place in the real world. But Ev and Biz weren't sold on the idea. Instead, they said they would come up with something better later, something friendlier. But it didn't matter what Ev, Biz, or anyone else who worked at Twitter thought or said. In an example of the site taking charge where the founders could not, people continued to use hashtags to organize everything, including group chats, conferences, and discussion of news events. Internally, amid the growing outages on the site, Ev and Goldman continued to try to forge Jack into a better CEO, a struggle that proved to be even more difficult than keeping the website alive. Ev, who had since taken on the role of chairman at Twitter, pressed Jack to supervise Blaine, who was often still anarchistic and thrived on the chaos, explaining how to give him financial incentives and set up regular check-in meetings. Yet this backfired when Jack started talking down to employees. Or, as I've noted in an email discussing the problem, Jack was acting like a cowboy. Each step forward felt like 2 steps back. When Ev told Jack to send a Twitter-wide email setting company goals, his first draft began with the subject line, 3 things I want for Twitter. Jack then went on to begin each milestone with the off-putting, I want to be able to, or I want, or I. Goldman suggested we might be a more appropriate way to address the company. Sounding like a dictator wasn't the best way to talk to your employees. Although Jack really wanted to learn how to manage, how to run a company, and how to be a good CEO, he often found himself at a loss for what to do next. Although he would never admit it, pretending that he knew exactly what he was doing, and that his actions were all part of a bigger, more resolute plan, he was so far out of his league that he was often speechless. When things grew frustrating, rather than confront the problem with his employees, Jack would walk out the front door of the office and then spend an hour or more walking in circles around South Park, a petulant look on his face. Some of his co-workers, including Biz and Crystal, believed that the company's problems weren't Jack's doing or undoing, that no one could keep Twitter afloat in these tumultuous seas, especially with the influx of new people joining each day. But Ev didn't care whose fault it was or wasn't. His personal money was invested in the company, and his name, again, was on the line. It didn't matter if it was Jack's fault or the Easter Bunny's. Ev wanted to stop the site outages, fix the lack of management, and settle the overall chaos of the company. As 2007 wore on, Ed was growing increasingly impatient with the reality that these issues weren't being fixed, and they were actually growing worse. The dressmaker. It was late in the afternoon when Jack and Ev walked up the stairs to the conference room that had been nicknamed Audio Heights. Their feet moved in sync, like 2 programmed robots, stair by stair, upward to the 2nd floor. They opened the door to the dinky meeting room, pulled back the chairs across from each other, and sat, hands clasped. Jeremy watched them ascend the staircase as they had done 100 times before, as did Blaine, and a few others in the office too. But no one paid them much attention. Just a normal meeting between the CEO and chairman of the company. They had no idea, until much later, at least, that Jack would walk up those stairs as one person and walk down as somebody completely different. 2 different Jack Dorseys. Things often don't break. They bend. Relationships rarely just splinter apart. They slowly start to bow, curving in another direction, distorting, and eventually separating. The relationship between Ev and Jack had been doing just that for some time, bowing like wet wood, moving between good and bad, but right now, as they shuffled into their seats in the conference room, it was about to break in two forever. Ev immediately dropped the gauntlet. "You can either be a dressmaker or the CEO of Twitter," Ev said, "but you can't be both." Although Jack worked hard, coming into the office well before anyone else arrived, he often left at around 6 p.m. to attend to one of his extracurricular activities. For a while he had taken drawing classes, sketching nudes in his notepad. He attended hot yoga classes, rushing off after work to contort his body into downward dog and sweat out the stresses of the day. He had also been taking classes at a local fashion school to learn how to sew, still contemplating a future career in fashion. He loved sewing and enthusiastically set out to learn how to make an A-line skirt for his first class assignment. The eventual goal was to make his own pair of dark jeans, maybe even end up working for his favorite jeans maker one day, Ernest Own in New York City. Jack's social life had also grown exponentially, just as Twitter had. People had started to invite him to parties, lots of parties. He was taken to baseball games by affluent bigwigs like Ron Conway. Girls were paying attention to him, including one, a 20-something blonde named Justine, who had gained a reputation in tech for dating several well-known startup founders. Jack was also feeling his first glimpse of fame as a Z-list celebrity in San Francisco, being written about in the media in Twitter-related articles and blog posts. For the first time in his life, the invisible boy from St. Louis was being recognized by tech enthusiasts at local coffee shops who showered him with their love of Twitter. People who used Twitter were also starting to be given ranking based on the number of followers they had on the site. And who better be the king of the nerds than user number one, Jack Dorsey? But there was one person who was not Jack's biggest fan, Ev. He believed Jack didn't work hard enough, wasn't in the office enough, was distracted by his hobbies, was too lackadaisical with his management style, was. When Ed was in the office, he demanded quiet. Jokes and chatter among co-workers were often met with a long shush from Ev. Biz, the always-on jokester, often laughed off the shushing, but Jack took such requests personally. Jack had been trying to befriend his employees, organizing movie nights and dinners on a regular basis. He had also started a new ritual called Tea Time, a weekly event for Twitter staff that was held on a Friday afternoon to discuss the company's latest news. Although people were supposed to drink tea at the discussion, they instead showed up with beer and other spirits. But Ev didn't care about tea time or movie nights. He was concerned with the company, a company that was in trouble. The continual site outages had started to take their toll on Twitter. For a few weeks, sign-ups had started to slow slightly, and Ev had sent emails sounding alarms. "You leave the office too early," Ev said. "You go off to your dressmaking classes and yoga and to socialize, and we have all these problems with the site, and growth is slowing." Ev went on listing Jack's flaws. Jack was furious but didn't respond. He didn't know how to respond. He didn't know if he could respond. Could a CEO argue with a chairman? It was unclear what Jack could and couldn't say to Ev, as their relationship and the power dynamic between them were full of twists and turns. They had started out as employer and employee, with Jack reporting to Ev, then became co-founders and friends as they started Twitter together. Then the roles of employer and employee had switched as Jack became the CEO and Ev. Although the lead investor in the company and chairman of his board was technically an employee reporting to Jack. Now, they were two people at odds with each other. It hadn't always been this way. For a time, they had become very close, bonding over Noah's Exodus, over winning at South by Southwest, and over drinks, which always helped them both loosen up. In late 2006 Electron Volts, Jack and Sarah had even gone skydiving together for Sarah's birthday, thrusting themselves out a perfectly good airplane and bonding over the experience of falling to Earth at 125 miles per hour. They'd even gone camping. But as quickly as they had become friends, their camaraderie had fallen apart. But more pressing than their opinions of how well the company was being run, Ev and Jack had fundamentally different views of what Twitter was and how it should be used. Jack had always seen Twitter as a status updater, a way to say where he was and what he was doing, a place to display yourself, your ego. Ev, who was shy and had been shaped by his days building Blogger, saw it as a way to share where other people were and what other people were doing. Ev saw it as a way to show what was happening around you, a place for your curiosity and information. This was a debate that had originated with the concept of Twitter as a news source after the earthquake months earlier. If there's a fire on the corner of the street and you Twitter about it, you're not talking about your status during that fire. Ev said during one of their unending discussions about the topic, "You're Twittering. There's a fire on the corner of 3rd Street and Market. No, you're talking about your status as you look at the fire," Jack replied. "You're updating your status to say, I'm watching a fire on the corner of 3rd Street and Market." To many this might sound like semantics. Yet these were two completely different ways of using Twitter. Was it about me, or was it about you? Was it about ego, or was it about others? In reality, it was about both. One never would have worked without the other. A simple status updater in 140-character posts was too ephemeral and egotistical to be sustainable. A news updater in 140-character spurts was just a glorified newswire. Though they didn't realize it, the two together were what made Twitter different. They also disagreed over the importance of mobile versus the web. Jack was adamant about focusing on mobile development, devoting resources to building new SMS tools, allowing more countries to sign up for service using text messages, and focusing energy on mobile applications. Ed was more focused on the web and was constantly pushing the team to expand features on the Twitter website. He also worried that an emphasis on text messaging was going to bankrupt the company. Each month, Twitter was being forced to pay cell phone carriers tens of thousands of dollars in SMS bills. And each month, the bills were higher than the last. The only thing that Ev and Jack agreed on was that there was very little Ev and Jack actually agreed on. Jack believed he had been growing and changing. He had even started to look more the part of a CEO, getting his hair cut, tucking his shirt in the boldest move yet, taking out his nose ring, the same nose ring he'd proudly worn under a Band-Aid years earlier rather than remove it at the behest of an employer. He wanted to lead Twitter enough to make that concession and others, but they weren't enough for Ev. Jack's bond with another employee of Twitter had also deteriorated. Earlier in the summer, Crystal's relationship with her boyfriend had fizzled. Although Jack now had lots of girls to choose from, he still yearned for his first audio crush. He had planned to ask Crystal out, to organize something special, maybe an old movie, a gesture that could move him from friend territory to kissing territory. But his courage had failed him when he lost her forever in Las Vegas. He knew exactly when it had happened. It was the weekend of September 7th, 2007. Twitter had struck a deal with the MTV Video Music Awards, where celebrity tweets, including those from rapper Timbaland and the band Dorsey, would be integrated into the channel's on-air programming during the award show. To help with the festivities and ensure that the non-techie musicians knew how to tweet properly, most of the team flew off to Las Vegas to help. But Jack couldn't attend, as a prior commitment took him elsewhere. At the end of the long weekend, the employees came back with dreadful hangovers and lots of stories of partying with the stars. Crystal, though, came back from Las Vegas with a new boyfriend, Jason Goldman. Jack was outraged. His one chance with Crystal had been stolen from him by one of Ev's best friends and one of the board members of Twitter. Jack versus Ev was now Jack versus Ev and Goldman. And as Jack saw it, Crystal was on the wrong side. Goldman wasn't deterred by Jack's anger about his new love affair. He was, after all, one of Ev's boys, not Jack's. What's more, Crystal could date whom she wanted. Jack's resentment toward Goldman over Crystal didn't compare, though, with the anger he was feeling toward Ev as he was told he could either be a dressmaker or the CEO of Twitter. There was no cursing during the meeting between the two that day. No screaming or fist-banging either. But with each critique slung across the table, Jack was seething. When the meeting finally ended, they walked down the stairs. As Jack sat at his desk, fuming at the things Ev had said to him, Ev grabbed his things and walked out. Jack shook his head at the irony. After railing against him for leaving the office early, Ev had done just that. And in that moment, the click of the beige front door, the departure of Ev, the relationship between Jack and Ev was no longer bending. It had just broken. Rumors. The rumors had been circling the valley for weeks. Twitter was raising its next round of funding. Love it or hate it, Twitter, a service that embodies our narcissism, is one that we can't stop talking about. O.M. Malik wrote in a blog post on May 21st, 2008, that buzz is turning into a bidding frenzy for the company's next round of venture funding. And a frenzy it was. Everyone wanted a piece of the company. In the outline that was sent around to investors at the time, Twitter laid out its stats. The company was now made up of 15 employees. There were 1,273,220 registered users on the service. Those people were sending almost 15 million status updates a month. The outline noted that updates were global, coming from all over the planet. But while the document showed rising numbers everywhere, there was one digit that hadn't changed since day one. Revenue equals $0, the presentation said. They were still paying the bills of the first round of financing from Fred Wilson and other investors a year earlier, but that money was quickly running out. The venture capitalists didn't care about the bills, which were flowing in. Each month's user growth was higher than the one before. The projections for the coming months higher still. The charts accompanying the presentations looked like stairways to heaven. Ev noted in his presentation that the company hoped to raise $10 million in capital at a rate that would put Twitter's valuation at $50 million. But by early May, amid the frenzy and excitement of investors hoping to attach their name to Twitter, the valuation of the company had jumped to $60 million. Then it spiked to $70 million a few days later. In the end, when the news finally broke, the company was worth $80 million. It didn't matter that Twitter still had no business model or even the faintest sign of one, or that the site was broken. Everyone still wanted a piece of the fledgling company because it was gaining so much attention. Investors wanted their names associated with the next big thing, and they believed they could help fix its problems. From the outside looking in, it appeared that Twitter was just growing too quickly. The venture capitalists lining the streets, ready to hand over millions of dollars, believed that with the right check and the right investor guidance, the company would be able to hire new engineers and scoop up a few new servers, and all would be right in the world. Of course, what happened inside the company was often very different from how things were perceived on the outside. Inside, it was complete disarray. In April 2008, Jack fired Blaine in an attempt to show Ev's control of the company. Internally, it was a typically ugly exit, with Blaine being sacked while he was on vacation. Yet externally, the tech media believed it was just an "oh shucks, it's time to move on and we're still friends" story. Then Jack fired Lee Midol, another senior engineer who had been hired only a few months earlier. After Blaine was fired, the site's problems only worsened. Blaine had been the core programmer at Twitter, and without him, Jack had no idea how to fix certain issues. Since the site's inception, when Twitter went down, people were greeted by a picture of a cat doing something funny. "I is in your computer," one notification proclaimed, a picture of a sleepy kitten curled up inside an old PC. As the company had grown up slightly, Biz decided the cat pictures were too jokey and went in search of something more serious. He soon came across an illustration on a stock photography site by Ying Liu, an artist and designer from Sydney, Australia, of a whale being lifted from the sea by some birds. This became the new image people saw when Twitter crashed. As the site was going offline so much, it didn't take long for the whale to garner its own nickname, the fail whale. There was also the bittersweet problem that celebrities were now using Twitter, bringing more followers and sign-ups with them. In a trend that would continue indefinitely, some of those celebrities would randomly show up at the office. The pilgrimage to the great blue bird. One morning, when a couple of engineers strolled into the office and walked into the kitchen to get their morning coffee, they found a member of the band Blink, 182, half asleep and half drunk, pouring a small bottle of gin into a bowl of Fruity Pebble cereal, then chowing down on breakfast. At other times, The rapper MC Hammer would show up out of nowhere with his entourage and just hang out. But the celebrities didn't get a true glimpse of Twitter either. They were ignorant of the disputes between Jack and Ev. Even the fundraising had been a clusterfuck, at least behind the scenes, where it had become another internal tug-of-war gone awry. Ev pulling on one end, Jack on the other. Biz try his best not to get caught in the middle. While Ev had been leading the funding talks, Jack felt excluded from the conversations. Wanting to prove to Ev that he could handle the task, Jack tried to negotiate with investors on his own. As a result, 1 minute a venture capitalist would get a call about a meeting from Ev, the chairman. The next, the phone would ring with Jack, the CEO on the line, hoping to set up the same meeting. To the venture investors, it just came across as a slight misunderstanding. To Jack, it came across as being slighted. One afternoon, Jack got on the phone with one of the venture capitalists and negotiated a deal that would value Twitter at $100 million with the latest fundraising. Proud of himself, he trudged off to tell Ev, but it was too late. Ev had already decided that he wanted to use another firm. The lead investor would be Spark Capital, and Bijan Sabet, a well-respected and kind partner at the Boston-based firm, would be joining the board of Twitter after it closed its $18 million round of investing in June 2008, which would value the company at $80 million. From Jack's perspective, the deal that he had struck was a better one than Ev's, and he was once again irate that Ev was going above him to make decisions. Though Jack didn't know at the time, for the funding round hadn't just been about the money or the valuation of the company. It had been about a bigger goal, fixing the company the best way Ev knew how, by taking more control of its daily operations. Fuck. Bijan's fingers moved on the keyboard in a repetitive motion. Back and forth he typed one single word, like a parrot with Tourette's syndrome. Then he hit send, catapulting the words in an email to Fred Wilson's inbox. Nothing else, just the word fuck 18 times. He didn't need to add anything to the message. No explanation was needed. Fred knew exactly what had just happened. Bijan buried his head in his hands, closed his eyes, and repeated the word one last time to himself. Fuck. In Twitter's $18 million round of financing, in June 2008, Bijan's company, Spark Capital, had invested $14 million, with Jeff Bezos of Amazon and Fred Wilson investing the majority of the other $4 million, along with several angel investors. The large sum put in by Bijan's company had secured him a seat on the board of Twitter, along with Fred Wilson. Over the next couple of months, Bijan had started to become entrenched in the company, attending a few meetings, raising his hands for a few critical infrastructure votes. And now here he was, fucking it all up already. He sat for a moment, pointlessly trying to reason whether he could somehow, by some means, any means, delete an email he had accidentally sent to Jack a few minutes earlier. It was impossible, he knew. You can't resurrect the dead or delete an email that has traveled 85,000 miles per second across from Boston to San Francisco. After a few seconds trying to calculate the incalculable, Bijan sat up and frantically began typing another email. To Jack, please call me when you get this message, he wrote, noting that he wanted to clear up his previous email. Out of context, this could be really confusing. It had all started in July 2008, when Twitter purchased its first company, SummyEyes, which used Twitter's third-party tools to allow people to search everyone's public tweets. People had taken to the feature as quickly as they had taken to Twitter itself. Before long, so many people were using SummyEyes that Twitter found itself competing with the company for page views. Rather than snuff it out, Twitter decided to purchase SummyEyes and its small team of highly competent engineers. The sale had been relatively painless. The initial negotiation between Fred and John Borthwick, an investor who was on SummyEyes' board, occurred while the two were standing next to each other at a bathroom urinal. Why don't we just join these companies and call it a day? John said as he peered over at Fred, a tinkling sound emanating from their respective urinals. Fred agreed. After a couple of in-person meetings, a deal was struck. July had already been a busy month as Twitter had also moved into new offices, a fancy, modern, loft-like space with lots of windows and room to grow. Among the fun features they had added to the office, Jack had suggested putting in a radio headroom. It can play Radiohead 24 hours a day, he said excitedly when suggesting the idea. After the company had signed the paperwork with Summy Eyes and divvied up Twitter stock as part of the sale, Jack got on the phone with Greg Pass, the engineer who had been running the tech side of Summy Eyes. Hey, so we're thinking that since we don't really have any real leadership here on the engineering team, that you can run all of it, Jack said. Greg sat silent for a moment, processing what Jack had just said, immediately realizing that something must be amiss at Twitter as he heard the CEO utter the words "no leadership" on the engineering team. Okay, Greg said, but before he had a chance to ask what Jack meant, he was interrupted. And Jack said, "How about you run the operations side too?" The operations side of the company included managing the so far disastrous scaling of Twitter servers. I don't have any experience running operations, Greg said. Well, there is no one here that can run it better than you, Jack replied matter-of-factly. When they got off the phone, Greg was shocked. And he wasn't the only one. Jack sent an email to the company announcing that there would be a management switch, that Greg was now director of operations, or ops for short, and overseeing all of engineering. When the message arrived in Ev's inbox, he was livid. You're just going to put someone in charge of engineering and ops for the entire company and not discuss it with me or the board, he said to Jack in pure frustration. It was enough's enough moment for Ev, but also for Fred and Bidgen. And in several secret calls and meetings, they decided it was time to figure out what was going on inside Twitter. Fred and Bidgen, now the two investors on the Twitter board, flew out to San Francisco from New York and Boston on the red eye. They set up meetings with Goldman, Biz, and Jeremy. For what? Oh, just to talk. We want to get your thoughts on how things are at Twitter. It was partially true. But in reality, Fred and Bidgen wanted Jack out. So, did Ev. The main purpose of the meetings was to learn how such a move would go over with employees. Twitter's senior staffers didn't need much cajoling. One by one, Goldman, Biz, and Jeremy were shuffled away from Twitter's office and into coffee shops and gently interrogated. Then the most senior employees were told that Fred and Bidgen, with the full support of Ev, were going to demote Jack, removing him as CEO. What do you think? They asked, even though the decision had essentially been made. Bidgen and Fred soon found out that Jack had been incompetent with the company's finances too. Although revenue was still at zero, expenses were quite the opposite, with growing server fees, text message bills, and payroll. Jack, who had been managing expenses on his laptop, had been doing the math incorrectly. When Ev learned about this, he asked a friend and seasoned entrepreneur, Brian Mason, to meet with Jack and show him how to manage the company's books. But Brian spent the entire meeting at a whiteboard with a marker explaining the basics of accounting. When Bidgen and Fred met with the engineers, they heard mostly worries about Jack. Engineering and ops are a disaster, they consistently said. He's a great guy, a great friend, a fun boss, but he's an over his head, another announced. He's like the gardener who became the president. I don't know who is in charge. Ev presents a product and vision for what's going on, and Jack just sits in the corner and takes notes. The board members knew they had to find a new role for Jack, or let him go immediately. Everything was all set. It was all about to happen. Then the plan came to a screeching stop. I'll quit, Biz said to Fred and Bidgen as he folded his arms and sat back in his chair like a petulant child. Should Jack be running Twitter? Probably not, Biz admitted, but he believed that forcing Jack out would tear Twitter in two. Although most employees would have helped pull Ev's side of the tug-of-war rope given the choice, and although Jack was completely out of his league as CEO, some Twitter employees, including Biz, still loved him. I'm serious. If you fire Jack, I'll quit. It was a bluff, but it worked. Fred and Bidgen knew they couldn't lose Biz, especially if they were pushing Jack out too. As Biz's job as co-founder had unfurled, he had started to serve two distinct roles at Twitter. First, he had become the public face of the company. Given Jack's and Ev's strange and often quiet public posture, Biz had stepped up his gregariousness and become the guy who joked with the press, enlivened employees, and often entertained the visiting celebrities. He had also become the moral line at the company. In late November 2007, Twitter had been used as a prop on the TV show CSI, Crime Scene Investigation. Tweets were used as clues to track down the victim of a murder. It didn't take long for fiction to turn into reality, and the FBI and other law enforcement started knocking at Twitter's door, demanding information on certain people who used the service. Biz and Ev, along with Crystal, had emphatically said no, adamant about protecting people's identities on Twitter, rather than caving to some big guys with guns and suits. While Bidgen and Fred were whisking employees away, Jack suspected something was amiss. Secret closed-door meetings, quiet phone calls from Ev in the conference room, but he had no idea about the severity of the situation. What's more, Jack had no idea that Biz's threat to quit was Jack's second reprieve in recent weeks. Another pardon had taken place earlier in the month after a disastrous attempt by Jack to break bread with Ev, whom he barely spoke to anymore. The two co-founders had agreed to meet for dinner to talk about the turmoil. Jack thought the purpose of the meal was to mend some broken bridges. He suspected Ev wasn't happy, but as neither of them was direct about his views and feelings, they had been skirting around the conversation. They met at Baker, a California fusion restaurant, in early August. The smell of burning would drifted through the air as they both doused their uncomfortable feelings with a few large glasses of alcohol. After long stretches of silence that were punctured by short bursts of small talk, they got down to business. "What's going on?" Jack asked Ev as they waited for their meal to be served. "You don't seem happy." Ev explained that the company's problems, the blackouts, the lack of communication with him and the board, and the text messaging bills that were approaching six figures, were all hurting the growth of Twitter. Ev noted that over the past few months the Twitter company blog had been one post after another explaining that the site was down. All of this, he said, was an embarrassment to Twitter. "Do you want to be CEO?" Jack interrupted point blank. Ev was caught off guard by the question. "Do you?" Jack asked again, in a rare stern moment. "Well, I've been thinking about things," Ev replied, taking a sip from his martini, then swerved and jumped back into a slew of other problems the company was going through. The lack of hiring, the costs, the chaotic culture. Jack interrupted again. "You're not answering the question. You have to tell me if you want to be CEO. I don't want to leave this table without knowing your intent. I do not want to work under a cloud." Ev paused briefly. He had not planned to tell Jack that evening about the board's plan to demote or remove Jack, but he was now being pressured to answer. He hadn't even told Goldman what was going on, fearing that such a conversation would be told his girlfriend, Crystal, and eventually come back to Jack. Finally, Ev took a deep breath and replied, "Yes, I want to be CEO. I have experience running a company, and that's what Twitter needs right now." "Fine," Jack said, a look of anger and disgust on his face. "I want to move immediately on this. I want to tell the management team tomorrow." After an extremely awkward dinner, Jack walked home panicking about what to do. When he opened the door to his apartment, he paced, his feet tapping the brown hardwood floor as he tried to clear his head. Then he dropped down onto his white couch, slipping his laptop out of his Filson bag and quickly rattling out an email to the senior management team telling them there would be an emergency meeting the following morning. Then he sent another message to Fred and Bidgen, describing the conversation with Ev. Jack then tried to go to sleep, but found himself lying awake in bed, tossing and turning as he replayed the evening's conversation in his head. He suspected that this was all some elaborate ploy by Ev to take power and control the company, and that the moment Fred and Bidgen read the news, they would stop the miscreant chairman. The next morning in the office, everyone filtered into a conference room for this emergency meeting. As Jack and Ev stood a few feet from the conference room door, about to walk inside, they both received a text message from Bidgen saying that they should call him immediately, together. "Do not do anything," Bidgen said. "Call me now." They walked out of the conference room, where the management team now sat utterly confused. And although they were about to get on the same conference call, Jack turned in one direction, entering the radio headroom, and Ev walked into another separate conference room, both to call Bidgen. "Look, we've heard what's going on, and we don't want you to do anything yet," Bidgen said. "Just hold off for now." While Jack listened, He paused for a moment as he heard Radiohead lyrics floating in the background in the tiny conference room. His iPhone pressed up to his ear, trying to block out the faint music. He looked in the direction of the speaker, briefly registering the irony of the song Karma Police, playing while he was embroiled in this confusing power battle with Ev. Bidgen continued, "Fred and I are going to fly out there next week and meet with you both and the management team," he said. The call ended, and Bidgen hung up the phone, relieved that he had held off the switch from one CEO to another. Ev and Jack opened their respective conference room doors simultaneously, paused briefly as they looked at each other as in a dramatic romantic comedy scene, then walked briskly across the concrete floor in the same direction to sit awkwardly and silently across from each other. In addition to creating the Radiohead room, Ev and Jack had agreed to sit in the same place in the new office. Their desks butted up against each other, back to back, like conjoined twins. As they shuffled into their seats after the call, their frustrated scowls were obscured by two large monitors that stood on the desks like sandbags piled high on a battlefield to hinder enemy fire. Although the call with Bidgen had stopped his execution, Jack now knew there were larger forces at work than just Ev. He sat, playing the things Bidgen had said over in his head and trying desperately to figure out what was going on. Words like yet and not now spun in circles but didn't offer clues to the future. It was a week later that Fred and Bidgen flew out to Twitter HQ. The plan all along had been to fire or demote Jack and put Evan as CEO. But when it came time to pull the trigger, Biz protected him temporarily. So Bidgen and Fred were left with no other option but to keep Jack in his current role. They sat him down and gave him an ultimatum. "You've got 3 months, they told him. 3 months to fix things and take control of the company. Of course, they knew Jack couldn't fix anything in 3 months or 3 years. He was incapable of running the company. It was like watching somebody try to build sand castles underwater. The two investors flew back to New York and Boston and started organizing a way to remove Jack, sending emails back and forth discussing a possible new job for him at the company. It was then that Bidgen made his heinous error. First thing in the morning, his coffee cup still full next to his computer, and weary from a night without much sleep, Bidgen accidentally pressed a reply to all button on his computer instead of replying just to Fred. "I believe Jack would take a passive chairman role," Bidgen wrote. It would then really be up to Ev to decide if he could live with Jack's new title. He hit send before he realized what he had done. Seconds later, he looked up at the exchange and uttered a word he was about to write 18 times in an email that he then sent Fred. Fuck, 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 fuck. He then quickly rattled off the email to Jack. "Please call me when you get this message." Out of context, this could be really confusing. But it was too late. Jack knew what was about to happen. Building sand castles underwater. The summer of 2008 was coming to a close, the seasons changing as August rolled into September, and Jack's 3-month reprieve began. Although Jack had spoken to Bidgen after the accidental email, he believed he could somehow save himself from being thrust out of the company. So he immediately went into panic mode and held a meeting with Twitter's leadership team to announce his battle plan. "Before we start, I want to take a moment to address the events of last week," Jack said. For me, it was a wake-up call. He took responsibility for the problems at Twitter, admitting that there was a lack of strong leadership. He also laid some of the blame on Ev and Goldman, noting that he needed to execute his own vision for the company, not theirs. And he admitted that Twitter needed to think bigger, as Ev had been saying since day one. But Jack's idea of thinking big wasn't to fix Twitter's endless 30-hour-long outages. It wasn't to resolve the bank robbery-size SMS bills. It was, as Jack outlined in an email to Fred and Bidgen, to be at the forefront of this historic 2008 presidential elections. As we've been pointing out consistently in the past, events, massively shared and immediate experiences, capture the essence and engagement of what Twitter has to offer the world, Jack wrote to the board. And the biggest shared event we can plan for already has traction with our users is right under our noses, will deliver us to mainstream usage, and is rapidly approaching. Then, beating the rallying drum, he announced, Twitter will be at the forefront of this historic 2008 presidential elections. Whether we do anything or not, It's going to be huge for us. Imagine how big it could be if we fully embraced it as a company." As they read, none of the team members were in support of this idea. Fred, "This won't solve our problems." Bidgen, "Oh, Jack." Ev, "WTF." Goldman, "What the hell is he thinking?" Blogger had been down this road before. For years earlier, Goldman had set out to the Democratic National Convention in Boston to try to persuade the media and attendees to blog. There he had seen firsthand that if people were going to use these new technologies, they did it of their own accord, not because a company willed them to. Goldman remembered the 2004 election vividly. He had hopped on the phone with Noah, who was in California, and explained the scene in Boston, recording a podcast that described the apocalyptic setting with thousands of Boston police and protesters. As the 2008 presidential election approached, people were no longer talking about podcasts or blogs. A new word had obliterated the vernacular of politics and media: Twitter. Outside, protesters were using the service to organize massive demonstrations against the police. Inside, a young senator from Illinois named Barack Obama was using Twitter to try to disrupt politics and grassroots campaigning, and he hoped win the election. And the media, including the Huffington Post, had set up Twitter accounts to update live snippets from the 2008 conventions. The reality was, Twitter didn't need to do anything to ensure that it kept growing. It was already on its way to becoming a personal newswire, as Biz explained it. Twitter continued to compress time, often reporting news more quickly than news outlets that had been in the business for more than a century. As more people joined the service, it moved even faster. During the 2008 conventions, the 1.4 million people who were actively using Twitter sent more than 365,000 tweets from both the Republican and Democratic conventions. Such numbers showed that the elections were important, Ev agreed, but they weren't more important than growing a tiny team of 22 employees and getting the site working properly. Like rolling blackouts in a country already starved of electricity, the site had continued to go offline daily. The fail whale took over the site almost hourly. Some outages lasted a few minutes, others more than a day. The fire hose, the name given to the stream of all the tweets coming to the service for third-party applications, would often turn off. As Jack got to work designing a dedicated elections page, Ev said nothing, waiting for Jack to fail. And it didn't take long. At the next board meeting, after going to slides announcing the number of new sign-ups, Fred and Bidgen asked Greg Pass, who was now running engineering and operations, to present a plan for how to fix Twitter's outages. It was an altogether impossible task, like asking a mechanic to figure out how to replace the engine of a moving car filled with 1.4 million passengers. The sun shone brightly through the conference room window when Greg walked in. He sat down slowly, methodically, like a doctor about to deliver bad news to a patient. Greg began by explaining that he built software to detect what was wrong with the site, to find out why it continued to go offline. As he opened his laptop and began talking, Jack sat silently. Ev, too. They had both been warned by Greg what he was about to say to Fred and Bidgen. "We have a bit of a problem," Greg began. While he had been running tests on the site, he had discovered that there was no backup of Twitter. "If the database goes down right now, we would lose everything," Greg said awkwardly. "Every tweet, every user, everything. Gone." "You're fucking kidding me," Fred said with almost comical disbelief. "Well, what the fuck are you doing in here?" As Greg rushed out of the room to figure out how to back up Twitter, everyone looked in Jack's direction. And although he didn't know at that moment, they all did. Successful election site or not, Jack Dorsey's days as Twitter CEO were numbered. Call my parents. The week Jack Dorsey was fired from Twitter began much like any other. Monday started with the usual Jack routine. He got up and made his white bed, showered, dressed in his dark blue Ernest-Own jeans and black cardigan, grabbed his keys and bag, and ran down the stairs. At some point that morning, Jack checked his email and was greeted by dozens of messages that had filled his inbox throughout the night. There was one message that stood out like police lights on a dark city street. It was from Bidgen and Fred, and had been sent at 7:41 a.m. on the East Coast. The subject line simply said, "Breakfast wed morning." Why were Bidgen and Fred asking to get breakfast on Wednesday morning? They weren't supposed to be in San Francisco that week. Did Ev know about this? Jack thought. He opened the email. "Can you meet with me and Fred before the board, MDG?" The message from Bidgen read, "Why don't we meet for breakfast wed morning at 7:45 a.m. at the Cliff Hotel? Let me know if that works." Jack glanced up at the time, where the numerals showed that it was 7:15 a.m. Pacific time. Fred and Bidgen wanted to meet exactly 48 hours later. Routine interrupted. Anxiety welled up in his chest. He knew almost immediately that this wasn't a good sign. As his mind raced with scenarios, he wrote a response. "That works. I'll see you there." He hit send, and the email made its way to Fred and Bidgen. He spent his commute on the Muni train, preoccupied with the meeting. The metal wheels clicked and screeched against the tracks as he tried to replay past conversations with the board in his mind. He glared out the window, asking himself why Fred and Bidgen wanted to meet. He was like one of Agatha Christie's fictional detectives trying to decode a meeting 2 days from now. His only clue a 43-word email. When Jack arrived at work, he stepped off the elevator into the Twitter office and was greeted by the familiar smell of percolated coffee that filled the hallway. He headed straight for Ev's desk, hoping by some miracle, by some obscure chance, he would be sitting there ready to answer questions. But Ev's desk was empty, just his roller chair, alone, his Mac computer, sleeping. As the afternoon drew on, Jack's anxiety still hadn't abated, so he decided to write Ev an email asking for some answers. He hit send, then waited for a reply. A phone call, a text message. For Ev to appear in front of his desk and explain what was going on. Ev never responded. Fred's hand scrunched around his face as he rubbed his eyes, trying to abate the tiredness that was consuming him. It was Tuesday morning, and he was exhausted after the 6-hour flight from New York. He was also starting to grow impatient, as the conversation seemed stalled. Bidgen started speaking again as it paced in his living room, his feet brushing against a white shag rug and the dark hardwood floor. In the background, his bookcase, filled with marketing, management, and business titles, watched over them. Surely one of these books covered this topic. Firing a CEO. The three had been talking for some time, having a variation on previous conversations that had taken place over the past few months. What if he goes to Facebook? Bidgen had asked on more than one occasion. We have to do something to make sure that doesn't happen. It'll look terrible for Twitter if the founder goes to Facebook. He's not going to go to fucking Facebook. Fred laughed, rolling his eyes in Bidgen's direction, his hand in its usual resting spot, his chin. Look, I get that he's all starry-eyed by Zuck, but he's not going to go work there. He could. Bidgen said and argued that the board should make Jack director of product or chairman, or give him another senior role at Twitter after he was let go as CEO, to ensure that he didn't go off to a competitor. But that wasn't an option either. Jack had been quite vehement when he'd been given his 3-month reprieve that if things didn't work out, he would not work for Ev. As the morning wore on, Ev cupped his phone in his hand and paced, looking at it every few minutes to see if one of his confidants, like Chris Sacca, an investor in Twitter and one of Ev's trusted friends, had called with some advice on the matter. I'm not giving him a fucking board seat, Ev snapped. He doesn't know what the fuck he's doing. Then there was a group discussion to just fire him and call it a day. But as I've noted, Biz and Crystal and the people who enjoyed working with Jack would be distraught. If Biz even knew about this discussion, he reminded them both he'd be fuming and might threaten to quit. At all costs, Biz must stay at the company, Ev said. Losing 2 of the 3 co-founders would be a disaster. The discussion went on for over an hour. Round and round the proverbial merry-go-round they went. And then, finally, a decision, a plan, an execution. Wednesday arrived quickly. Jack awoke weary and anxious. He felt sapped as he stepped off the train in the Tenderloin, plodding up the steps to exit the station. He kept his head down as he walked in the direction of the Cliff Hotel. Although it was still early, homeless people were everywhere, spilling out of halfway houses. Hookers, a familiar scene of leftovers from a night before in the Tenderloin, stood about without a care in the world. As Jack approached the hotel, the doorman pulled back the large glass door and repeated his morning announcement to guests. "Good morning, sir." Not for Jack, it wasn't. Jack was reminded of the sounds and the smell of the hotel from the last time he had stayed there. A year earlier, when Twitter was just a hatchling, he had spent 2 nights at the Cliff, a staycation in his own city, wining and dining in the hotel. He had worked too, spending an evening writing the code that would connect people's names together using the now famous symbol. As the door to the Cliff swung open, he walked inside, looking around for Fred and Bidgen. At the moment Jack exited the Muni train, across the city, Goldman's phone vibrated in his pocket as he took a sip from his morning coffee. He looked at the screen, and a bit of confusion set in. A text message from Ev said to meet at Ev and Sarah's apartment on 4th Street in an hour. Greg got the same message. Biz too, as did Abdur Chowdhury, who had joined Twitter during the Summiai's acquisition. Each thought the same thing. A meeting, this early in the morning, at Ev's. Can't be good. They all arrived, separately, buzzing as the door clicked open, into the elevator, into Ev's house. Before long, the group of Twitter executives were sitting at Ev's kitchen table, sipping coffee and waiting to find out why they were there so early in the morning. "So, Ev, you want to tell us what's going on here?" Biz asked after everyone was settled. Goldman looked up, nudging his glasses with his finger to push them back up his nose. They all noticed that Ev was fidgety. Not a good sign. As some of them knew, fidgety meant someone was getting fired. Ev looked down at the table, as everyone looked back. His arms crossed. He took a deep breath and then began to talk. Jack walked by the huge, blazing fireplace in the lobby of the Cliff Hotel. He spotted Fred and Bidgen sitting in the rear of the hotel's Velvet Room restaurant. They were in a round booth, their backs pressed against the dark brown leather. 7 ornate light bulbs hung from the ceiling, encircling them both. "Hey, Jack," Fred said, motioning to an open black chair at the end of the booth. "Take a seat." Fred was already tearing apart the eggs on his plate. Coffee cups had been refilled more than once. It was clear there had been a meeting before this meeting. Bidgen seemed more solemn, pursing his lips as he nodded in Jack's direction and almost whispering, "Hey, buddy." Jack sat, his hands clenched under the table. In an almost sad whisper he asked, "How's it going?" Fred was about to start speaking. There would be no small talk here, when the waitress interrupted. "Coffee?" she asked with a smile. Jack's stomach, already churning like a washing machine, couldn't even handle chamomile tea, never mind coffee. "No, thanks. I'll have a yogurt, please." Then, as she turned to walk away, Fred dropped the guillotine. "So we're making FCO," he said, his fork clenched in his hand. "You're going to get a passive chairman role and a silent board seat. We have some paperwork for you and a recommendation for a lawyer." Jack felt like he had just been hit in the face with a baseball bat. "Say that again," he stuttered to Fred, thinking he had heard incorrectly. Fred repeated himself almost verbatim. "We're making Ev CEO. You're getting a passive chairman role. You will have a silent board seat. Here's the paperwork. Call a lawyer." Jack was told that the chairman title was more honorary than actually functional. His board seat wouldn't actually be a board seat at all. Instead it was silent, which meant it belonged to Ev, who would maintain Jack's voting rights. Jack would now be the company mascot, unable to make any decisions about Twitter. Passive, silent, Ev, in comparison, was a majority stakeholder in Twitter, with 4 times as much stock as Jack, and would now have 2 board seats. At almost the exact same moment, Ev spoke from the same mental script to the Twitter executives gathered around his kitchen table. "Jack's out," he said. "The board met. This is a final decision. They want me to be CEO, and Jack will become chairman," he continued. "The board is telling him right now. Today will be his last day." They all looked back in shock as Ev continued talking, explaining why the board had made the decision. Jack stared at Fred, not sure what to say, as Bidgen started talking. You know, you're really good, Bidgen said, his eyes calm as he looked at Jack. It was clear that his role was to be good cop to Fred's bad cop. You're a founder of the company, and we really believe in your vision, so we want you to stick around. Fred interrupted him. It's effective immediately, Jack. It has to be. Jack realized this wasn't a hostage negotiation. This was it. What? When did that happen? Biz said, annoyed. Come on. What the fuck? What happened? Ev tried to calm him, saying it wasn't entirely his decision, that the board had been pressing for a new leader and it was either Ev or an outside CEO. Ev had even gone on a search for a replacement, interviewing a few external candidates to run the company. But in the end, Ev made the most sense. He reiterated that he had experience running a company, adding that it was going to be the job of the people sitting at that table to tell the employees and ensure that morale stayed solid through the swift transition. Jack rocked back and forth slightly in his chair, looking down at his untouched yogurt. You've done amazing things for the company, Bidgen said. But the site still keeps going down and the SMS bills, and we just can't wait anymore. But what about the 3 months? Jack interrupted, anger now taking over his voice. Most of their words were starting to sound muffled as he looked up at them. We're going on all cylinders and the election is coming up and... Bidgen and Fred continued to talk on their script, irrelevant of what Jack had to say. They explained that he wouldn't get all of his stock options, that he had not fully vested, so they would be taking some of them back. But because they liked him, he was getting more than he deserved. But what about my 3 months? Jack repeated. You said. It's done, Jack, Fred said apologetically. You can't tell anyone yet, Ev told the group as a barrage of questions came in. Goldman immediately protested. He was going to tell Crystal, who was now his live-in girlfriend. No, you can't. Ev's voice was now becoming stern. I get that she's your girlfriend, and that she's really close with Jack, but we can't have all the employees finding out about this before we tell them. It'll be fucking chaos. So, I'm supposed to just lie to my girlfriend? Goldman said with anger and sarcasm in his voice. Yes, you need to learn to separate business and relationships, Ev responded. It was one of the few moments that Goldman felt a dislike for Ev. As he was about to respond, Biz interrupted them both. Have you spoken to Jack? No, Ev said, then repeated what he had said earlier. The board is with him now. Jack was panicked as he stood on the sidewalk in front of the Clift Hotel. He peered down, scanning the legal documents. Certain words leaped out at him. Numbers, percentages, dollar symbols. But they were all lower than they should be. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, scrolling frantically for Greg Kidd's number. Kidd was one of the few people Jack trusted in San Francisco. As of a few minutes ago, he might have become the only person he trusted in San Francisco. The two had worked together in the past, and although a business they had once started in partnership had ended with near bloodshed, Kidd had always been there for Jack. In 2005, after Jack had spent a week at Burning Man, traipsing through Black Rock City and dancing inebriated until sunrise to techno music, he had shown up on Kidd's doorstep in Berkeley, jobless and essentially homeless. He had been a different Jack back then, sporting blue dreadlocks and grimy clothes. Still, Kidd had taken him in and let him stay in the guest house in the backyard. He also gave him a job as a nanny for his newborn baby. A blue-haired, dreadlocked nanny with a nose ring in Berkeley. He fit right in. Greg, they fired me, Jack said, his voice frantic. They took away my stock and they fired me. They made FCEO and I... Just relax for a second. Hold on, Kidd said, interrupting him. What's going on? Jack explained the conversation, what Fred and Bidgen had said, that he would technically no longer work for Twitter. After a few minutes listening, Kidd explained that there wasn't much Jack could do. Ev owns a majority of the company. You don't, he said. You should call that lawyer. Ev closed the door behind him as they left the apartment. Goldman was clearly upset. Biz too. Greg and Abdur, who were more employees of the company than friends of Jack, seemed almost relieved. They all walked to the office together. Jack hung up the phone with Kid and started walking quickly. He didn't know where to go. He couldn't go back to the office. He walked briskly down Geary Street, then took lefts and rights, and had soon trudged more than a mile. He was frantic when he paused in front of one Embarcadero, a giant concrete building near the water's edge, the same place where Noah had ridden his bike when he had been cast out of the company 2 years earlier. Cast out by Jack, who had given him an ultimatum. It's Noah or it's me. Now it was Jack's turn. He stopped and sat on the cement steps as people with jobs brushed by in suits and heels, off to work for the day. Then, the emotions too much, his throat started to itch. He started to cry, his head in his arms. He sat on the steps, sobbing. Alone. The door to the office opened, and Ev walked in, Goldman, Biz, Abdur, and Greg in tow. Rebecca, Jack's assistant, immediately rushed over and asked where Jack was. After a brief pause, Biz spoke. We had an off-site executive meeting today, and Jack will be out of the office for some other meetings, he said. He then looked over at Ev and said, Hey, you got a second? They walked into a conference room near the kitchen, the door closing behind them. Look, I get this is the best thing for the company. I just wish I would have known first. Biz said. Ev listened, agreeing while trying to explain the situation he was in with the board and the legal aspects of transition. They sat for a brief moment in silence. A deep sigh came from Biz, then he spoke. I should probably go talk to Jack, huh? Yeah, that's probably a good idea. Ev said. He has to come into the office tomorrow to tell everyone, so we'll have to make sure he knows what to say. Biz pulled his phone out of his pocket and sent Jack a text message. Jack's phone had been going all morning. His assistant was trying to reach him. Text messages, emails, missed calls. He didn't respond. What could he say? I'm not coming in today. I've been fired. Suddenly a message from Biz popped up saying they should talk. They arranged to meet at Samovar Tea Lounge in the Yerba Buena Gardens, near the Twitter offices. The two had spent countless hours and lunches there, often talking about Twitter or other projects they wanted to work on together one day. Jack would sip his favorite tea, masala chai, and mostly just laugh as Biz would crack jokes. There would be no jokes on this particular morning. No masala chai either. The two sat outside on a wooden bench, looking out at the city. The sky had opened up, and Biz squinted as he looked at Jack in the glaring brightness. He could see his eyes were puffy and red. So, obviously you heard. Jack said. Yeah, Ev told us this morning. Biz said quietly. We're not telling the rest of the company yet, though. What do you think I should do? I think you should come in and talk to Ev and figure out what to say to everyone. They talked about the discussion at the Cliff Hotel, and Jack told Biz he knew Ev was behind it all. That this was a coup by Ev, not the board. You don't know that, Biz said, like a wind changing direction. Biz could feel Jack's tone and demeanor go from pain and sadness to anger and vindictiveness as he heard Jack say, I'm going to go in and tell the whole company what happened. I'm going to tell them Ev fucked me and he threw me out of Twitter because he wanted to be in control. I'm going to tell them everything. No, you can't do that. This is about Twitter and all the people that work there, Biz said, sensing the panic in Jack's voice. This isn't about you and Ev. It's bigger than that. Biz suggested they go for a walk to cool off, hoping to calm Jack down. They strolled around the block a few times. After a while, Biz needed to get back to the office, but they agreed that Jack would come in later that afternoon to talk to Ev. It was dark outside as Jack sat in the Twitter conference room waiting. He was drained from the day. Ted, the company's lawyer, had explained that everything had been done by the book. Ev was a majority shareholder. Jack was not. 20 minutes had already gone by as Jack sat there. He was growing angrier by the minute. Biz was at his desk nearby, writing the blog post that would go online the following day announcing Jack's departure from the company. Meet our CEO and chairman. Again, the title of the post would read. It would praise Jack for his artful minimalism and simplicity, combined with great vision and ambition. and it would say that Jack and Ev had decided to make the switch, that it was the best thing for the company. We took a good look at our path forward and saw the need for a focused approach from a single leader, the blog post would say. But it wasn't the focused single leader Jack wanted. As Biz wrote an email to the employees telling them to meet for an all-hands meeting the following morning, the door to the conference room where Jack had been waiting opened and Ev finally walked in. What the fuck? Jack said, pronouncing the K as if this were the last word he would ever utter. Jack's adrenaline was pounding. I'm sorry. These things aren't always easy, Ev said calmly. He had fired a dozen people before, but never a CEO. No, they're not fucking easy when you go behind someone's back to have them thrown out of their own company. Jack said, you had the opportunity to tell me exactly what you wanted, to tell me exactly what I was supposed to be doing, but instead you went behind my back. Ev was silent, and I don't think it's right or fair that you took my stock away. Jack said, this is my company. You can't take my stock away. We're not taking your stock away. You haven't fully vested yet. Ev said, you've only been a full-time employee for 2 years, and your stock hasn't fully vested. So no, we're not taking anything away. We're actually giving you more than you deserve. Jack laughed maniacally. You're giving me more than I deserve. Please. You guys are fucking me, and you know it. Ev tried again to explain the vesting time frame, but Jack interrupted. This is my company. Jack slammed. I put so much more into it than you have. After Jack railed for a while, Ev calmly responded, this isn't your company. It's done. The following morning, Friday, Twitter employees shuffled in and grabbed their spots in the lounge, unsure what the announcement might be. Some people sat on the gray sofas in the meeting area, which was designed to look like a living room. A huge flat-screen TV hung on the wall. Others pulled over white office chairs. The company was still small, with just under 30 employees and freelancers. Ed was clearly fretful as he stood to the side with a worried-looking Biz. Ed was peering down, his feet shuffling back and forth on the concrete floor, fidgety, as if he were trying to kick away a piece of gum that wasn't actually there. People could immediately sense something was off. A few minutes later, Jack arrived, walking out in front of the employees to deliver his brief address. His hands were shaky, his heart pounding. It was clear to everyone he was nervous. The board has decided, he said, then paused. And I agree. Another pause. That I'm going to step down as CEO. The last pause. Ed will take over. The employees were stunned by what they had just heard. Jack went on to talk about how much he would miss everyone. And for the first time, he told a story he would repeat for years, that he would still be around as the executive chairman, involved in a larger role at Twitter. He didn't explain that his chairman title was a sham and meant nothing, that he was completely out of a job at the company he had co-founded, that he had been fired. When he was done, he walked away, past Ev, whose turn was to walk to the center of the living room area and greet employees. The two didn't make eye contact. I know that some of you felt like the company has sometimes been run like a two-headed monster, Ev said, now fidgety and anxious too. Like you didn't know who to go to with questions or who was in charge. He went on to say that the decision was the best thing for the company, that he and Jack agreed. Biz spoke too, trying to quell any concerns employees had. Secretly, some of the employees were elated. Although they wouldn't say anything to Jack, they knew he was in over his head and had been for a long time. And they believed Ev, who had managed and sold Blogger, would be able to provide better leadership for the shaky startup. But two people were clearly distraught, Jeremy and Crystal. Jack was in the kitchen with them as Ev wrapped up his sermon. Crystal was sobbing. After Noah had left a couple of years earlier, he had disappeared as a friend. She worried that the same would happen with Jack. Jeremy, normally not one for tears, was choked up too, partially thankful Ed was taking over, but deeply disappointed that Jack would no longer be working at the company. They all hugged, and Jack could feel tears welling up in his eyes, but he held them back. He couldn't cry in front of his employees. That is not what exes do. When Ev and Biz wrapped up their speeches, They told everyone a blog post would be going up on the site to announce the changes, and instructed them not to speak to the press or tweet about it. Ev walked over to the kitchen where Crystal and Jeremy were talking to Jack, motioning for Jeremy to come in his direction. "I need you to go and disable all of Rebecca's accounts," Ev ordered, as Jeremy stood with a shocked look on his face. "I need you to do it now. Disable her email, login, computer." Ev repeated, "Everything." Then he told Rebecca she was fired too. Jack looked over at Ev and Jeremy as they spoke outside the kitchen. "I'll be right back," Jack said to Crystal. "I have to make a couple of calls before the blog post goes up." As Jack walked out of the kitchen, he looked up at the silver and white clock on the wall, which read 11:59 a.m. He reached into his pocket for his phone, opened up the Twitter application, and tweeted, "Calling my parents." His mother started crying on the phone when she heard that he was stepping down. But Jack convinced his parents that it was his decision, that he agreed it was best for the company. Then he hung up. Compared with the next call he had to make, talking to his parents had been easy. He turned around to make sure no one was within earshot. Then he opened the address book on his phone, scrolled down past the people's names that began with the letter J, then past K, then L, and finally arrived at the number he was looking for. Mark Zuckerberg, CEO of Facebook. He peered over his shoulder again as Crystal and Ev and others stood talking by the kitchen, then looked back at his phone as he pressed the phone number next to Mark Zuckerberg's name. 4. #Ev, the third Twitter leader. Jack sat glaring at Ev, not a word coming out of his mouth, his eyes so steady and precise you'd have thought he was in the middle of a staring contest. Except his opponent, Ev was trying his best, as difficult as it was, to ignore him. People hear about Twitter a lot, but don't know what it is or why they want to use it. Ev read aloud from his slide deck, periodically glancing at Goldman, Bidgen, and Fred, who tried to listen attentively, though they too were distracted by Jack's silence. Still, Ev went on. It was October 22nd, 2008, Ev's first board meeting as CEO, just 3 weeks after Jack had been ousted. Ev was explaining that the 2008 elections website, which Jack had previously put all of his efforts behind, was a wrong approach for Twitter. On average, it only generated 35,000 page views a day, Ev said, pointing to a jagged graph to back up a statement. Next to the chart were sampled tweets on the site that were more high school jokes than intellectual punditry. Palin is a SMLF, one read, as Ev noted that a SMLF was a sexy mom I'd like to fuck. Then Ev moved on to more important matters, patiently going to the agenda. Venture debt, finances, burn rates, hiring plans, revenue, spam, and how to reduce Twitter's now infamous downtime. It was clear to everyone in the room that there was now an experienced CEO running the company, one who had a plan to fix all of the above. Although some employees had been sad to see Jack go as a friend, they were relieved they no longer had to report to him as a boss. In the months leading up to Jack's departure, employees had complained to senior staffers that Jack had acted like a cowboy when he was CEO, sometimes ordering people around and rarely trusting those who worked below him. When Ev stepped up to take charge of the company, he took a completely different approach to management, always trusting employees from the get-go, which gave them a sense of pride and, in turn, a loyalty to Ev and Twitter. Jack's stare was interrupted when the following words came out of Ev's mouth. Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook. In the weeks leading up to Jack's firing, Facebook had been trying to buy Twitter. Mark had made it his personal mission to woo Jack into selling the little blue bird of Facebook. After Jack was let go, it was the 2 other Twitter co-founders who now needed romancing. Biz and Ev had driven down to Facebook's campus a few days earlier to meet with Mark. Like most meetings involving the chief of Facebook, it had been almost unbearably uncomfortable. When Ev and Biz arrived at Facebook's campus, they were given what seemed like an endless tour, then ushered into a small office space with Mark. The room was gray and relatively sparse, looking more like a Russian prison than part of the office of the hip social network. Given the limited seating options, Biz and Ev chose a tiny 2-seater couch that butted up against the wall. Facebook's boys so had rushed to take the only other seat in the room, an almost high chair that sat above them on a higher plane. Facebook and its CEO looking down on Twitter and its CEO. Should I close the door or leave it open? Ev asked. Yes, Mark replied. Ev looked at Biz, who shrugged. Yes, I should close it, or yes, I should leave it open? Ev asked. Yes, Mark said again. Ev decided to play it safe, leaving the door half open and half closed. Mark started talking, pausing slightly as he spoke from a script in his head. Every word was calculated, every sentence plotted, every comma mapped out. He was like an army general meeting on the battlefield to discuss merging armies. What do you think your valuation is right now? Mark asked as they both sat uncomfortably across from and below him, peering up at a boy who could, hypothetically speaking, quite happily buy them or murder them, all with the same exact expression on his face. Throw out a number, Mark said. Ev paused, looking at Biz, then fired off a shot. 500 million. Silence filled the room. Mark looked at them, unfazed. That's a big number. That's what we believe we're worth, Ev said. But Mark had already known that Twitter believed it was valued at 500 million. Jack had told him so. Although Biz and Ev didn't know it, Jack had also been meeting with Mark, which was why Jack had called Mark right after he had been fired, to tell him what was going on and to set up a secret meeting that was not about the sale of Twitter to Facebook anymore. Jack had no control over that aspect of Twitter now. No, instead, Jack Dorsey, the co-founder of Twitter, was going to try and get a job at Facebook. Are you sure there's nothing we can do? Mark had said on the phone to Jack, when he had called the day he had been fired, I bet there's something we can do to keep you as CEO. Jack had been a little stunned by Mark's remark, unsure what such a statement could possibly mean. No, I don't think there's anything we can do, Jack had replied nervously. Mark wasn't happy. His attempt to seduce Jack had been going well, and he had been methodical, starting with a phone call between the two that was organized by Matt Kohler, a wheeler and dealer in the Valley and an early Facebook employee. Then there had been an in-person meeting between Jack and Mark. More wooing, more romancing, and it had worked. Days after their meeting, an email from Mark had arrived in Jack's inbox with an ominous subject line that simply said T. In the long message, he had laid out point by point the reasons why Twitter and Facebook made sense for each other, that together they could change the world, connect people, make billions of dollars. Then, as Mark often did when he was tried by companies, he had noted that if the founders chose not to sell, Facebook would continue to build products that move further in their direction. A threat with a kiss. You join Facebook and we live happily ever after. Or you say no and we do everything in our power to destroy you. Another possibility, to get fucked. Jack hadn't needed threats. He had been sold. Yet as the deal had approached the finish line, as Jack had been ready to press his foot on the gas pedal, Ev had taken the keys out of the ignition, thrusting Jack out of the driver's seat, spinning the wheel, and turning the company in a completely different direction. Although the prospect of selling Twitter for $500 million was appealing to everyone on the board and a far cry from the 12 million Yahoo had offered just a year and a half earlier, and although Ed was worried Facebook would try by any means to destroy Twitter, he didn't believe in Facebook's mission. It seems to me there are 3 reasons to sell a company. Ev wrote in an email to the board outlining why they should decline Facebook's offer. 1, the price is good enough or a value that the company will be in the future. 2, there's an imminent and very real threat from a competitor. 3, you have a choice to go and work for someone great. Ev saw Blogger, Audio, and now Twitter as serving a much more important purpose than just becoming big businesses. These startups he had helped build were all designed to give people across the planet an equal voice, to help those without power stand up to those who abuse power. Twitter, he believed, which could work via text message on any phone or using a web browser, could be the ultimate tool for that. He presumed that Facebook was more concerned with being a corporate money machine. Jack wasn't completely convinced by Ev's decision not to sell to Facebook and replied the message, if the numbers are right, there's a success story in either path. But it didn't matter what Jack said. He had no voting rights anymore. He was an invisible chairman. sitting in Ev's board seat, his title a conciliatory prize from Ev to help Jack save face when he was let go. After a private call with the board on October 30th, the people who did have power agreed that there was no interest in selling to Facebook. Later that evening, Ev called Mark, telling him he was honored by the offer to buy the company, but Twitter wanted to remain independent. Although the call ended amicably, Mark did not like to lose, and he switched his battle plan from trying to buy Twitter to trying to hire Jack. He reasoned that such a move could show a lack of confidence in Twitter, its co-founder moving in with its biggest competitor. If such a move were to happen, publicly it could have been seen as revenge upon the people who had ousted him or a battle of Jack's and Ev's product ideas. So the conversation between the two progressed. Mark asked Jack to meet with Chris Cox, who ran product at Facebook, at the local Pete's Coffee in Palo Alto. They chatted for a while, Jack sharing ideas about social networks. A few days went by and Jack got on the phone again with Mark. "So what do you think?" Mark said, "I think you'd be a great fit for the company." "What would my role be?" Jack asked. "I want to run product there." But they both knew that wasn't an option. That role was taken by Chris Cox. All of the other senior roles Jack would fit into were already filled too. "Why don't you just come here and we'll figure out a position for you?" Mark said. Jack sat there, the phone pressed his ear, thinking about Mark's offer. Although no one in the media knew that Jack had been fired from Twitter, the narrative had been sold as Twitter CEO and chairman switch roles. The story that was out there had been picked up by the mainstream press. And Jack knew that if he was going to make the jump to Facebook, that news would similarly be splayed across the headlines. Such attention would be a double-edged sword. Sure, it would be payback toward Ev, Fred, and Bidgen for pushing him out of the company, an embarrassment to them that the co-founder of Twitter had jumped to its biggest competitor. But he knew it would also be a stamp on his image. If the headlines read, "Jack Dorsey, Twitter co-founder, joins Facebook AS Executive Vice President of Product," it would be a win for Jack. But if the headlines read, "Jack Dorsey, Twitter co-founder, joins Facebook without a fancy job title," then it would be 10 steps back in his career. "Let's just keep talking and see if we can find the right position for me," Jack told Mark. "I've got to think about this, and if I'm going to come there, I want to do it right. Fight or flight." As 2009 rolled into view, Jack set off in search of what to do next. Now that the possibility of working at Facebook had been put on hold indefinitely, he had no idea what lay ahead. But he was sure about one thing. He was determined not to follow in the footsteps of the co-founder who had left Twitter before him. Since his ousting, Noah had fallen off the face of the earth, no longer showing up at parties, conferences, or bars, and no one seemed to have noticed. Before disappearing, and before Jack was fired, Noah had emailed Jack twice to ask if they could meet to talk. But Jack had never responded. At the time, he'd had more important things to do. Then, in late 2008, Noah decided to try Ev. Although they were once inseparable friends, they had not spoken since South by Southwest a year earlier. Ev agreed to meet with him at the new Twitter offices on Bryant Street. When Noah stepped out of the elevators and through the new front door, he entered a different company. Dozens of engineers buzzed around. Fancy stickers were tacked to walls, and wide glass windows lit the large, loft-like space as the soft-hum of cars trundled by outside. On that particular morning, so many people were in meetings that there were no conference rooms available. So Ev and Noah sat in the open living room area on 2 gray couches, the same place Jack had stood a few weeks earlier and announced his exodus to his employees. No one stopped by to greet Noah, as most of the employees didn't know who he was. After some small talk, Noah dove right in. "I feel like I'm being written out of history," he told Ev. "I had a lot to do with the creation of Twitter, and I'd like to be included in the story." Noah had repeatedly felt slighted by events that had taken place, and he felt he needed to talk to his co-founders. Noah had tried to divert his attention elsewhere over the past 2 years, and had attempted to birth other startups. Yet most of his ideas, though brilliant, were shuttered by the past. It wasn't a lack of skills or creativity or money. He'd made a couple $100,000 from the sale of audio to Ev. That became roadblocks. It was that he felt betrayed by his friends and co-workers. As the relationship between Jack and Ev had severed, Ev started to feel bad for what had transpired with Noah, though he still didn't tell him Jack had been the main catalyst for Noah's firing. Ev had offered to give Noah a small portion of stock from his personal equity share of the company, a gesture that helped soften the blow, but didn't change Noah's sadness. Ev had often been generous with his money. In the early days of Twitter, Jeremy's house in West Oakland had been robbed. Thieves tore down the front door and took his family computers, important documents, and his 4- and 7-year-old boy's pink piggy banks, filled with almost $200 in change. When Ev found out, he quietly pulled Jeremy aside in the office, handed him his personal credit card, and told him to replace everything that had been stolen, without expectation of receiving anything back. Ev had done the same for Biz when he was running out of money, writing a check for $50,000 to help cover his bills and mortgage payments. But money wasn't enough to help Noah. By the time Noah sat on the couch to talk to Ev, Twitter had practically become particles in the air that everyone was breathing, which for Noah was particularly bittersweet. It was as if he had helped invent the sky, choosing the color palette that would hover above everyone, and then, banished by its other inventors, was unable to escape from it. In Silicon Valley, where people have an incredibly difficult time talking about anything other than technology, Noah felt like he was being stalked by his past with every turn in conversation. The little blue Twitter logo lingered on the chalkboard to bars, on the menus of restaurants, on food trucks, in conversations. Like everyone else in the area, he couldn't get away from it. "Are you on Twitter?" new friends would ask, unaware of his role in the creation of it. "Look, I know you were a big part of the early story," Ev said to Noah on the couch, "but it's a completely different company now." After a brief chat about the past, Noah left the office that day, the door to the busy and flourishing Twitter offices closing behind him. And then he was gone. He packed his life into boxes, sent one last tweet from San Francisco. "Ha! I just bought a giant semi-truck. Trying to figure out how to drive the fucker. Got a place in Venice Beach. Moving this weekend. Smiley face." And drove south to Los Angeles, the windows down as a different air flowed into his car. On the radio, he heard some of the same music on the trip he had made a couple of years earlier with his former best friend, Jack, on their way to Coachella. But on this trip, he was lonely. He tried to find solace in Twitter, sending a few messages about his journey, but that only made him feel worse. No one replied to his tweets. His original vision of a product that would allow him to talk to his friends didn't matter if he had no friends to talk to. When he pulled up to the sunny land of Los Angeles, he soon settled into a lofty warehouse space near Venice Beach and tried to start a new life. For a time, he started to feel a happiness he hadn't felt in a while, but it was short-lived. Stories about Twitter had started to crop up on the business and technology pages of news outlets and into every crevice of culture. Even the sports section had been covering Twitter. On a Wednesday morning in November 2008, an article in the New York Times announced that Shaquille O'Neal, the 7'1" behemoth of a basketball player, had joined the service. Although Twitter had savored fake accounts since its inception, these lampoons were now starting to draw the attention of the real celebrities. A fake Shaquille O'Neal had graced Twitter for some time. That account was now going to be replaced by the real Shaq, who was going to bring his celebrity friend with him. And where the celebrities went, their fans followed. The same fans who now lived on Venice Beach in Los Angeles. Noah's new neighbors. Soon, just as in San Francisco, the blue bird appeared. "Hey, have you ever heard of Twitter?" people asked Noah in bars along the Venice boardwalk. "Whoa, why do you have so many followers?" they said in coffee shops on Abbot Kinney Boulevard. Twitter's prominence in the headlines reached a pinnacle during an event dubbed Miracle on the Hudson, when an Airbus A320 with 155 passengers on board took off from New York's LaGuardia Airport and was struck by a flock of birds. It landed safely in the Hudson River. A picture of the passengers escaping from the downed plane landed on Twitter, taken by a tourist on a ferry who had snapped a photo with his phone. And then it was all over the web, magazines, and the nightly news. Twitter, 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 Twitter. Noah couldn't escape, and he tried to retreat more. He turned off his phone, his computer, anything connected to the internet, hoping that distance and time would heal his wounds. At the end of 2008, Jack was starting to go through the same thing as Noah, but he chose to deal with it in a completely different way. Shortly after he was fired from Twitter, Jack, like Noah, was despondent. Like Noah, he traipsed through San Francisco, miserable and seething with resentment. And like Noah, he went on a walkabout to try to figure out what to do next. But that was where their paths diverged. Although Jack had lost some of his equity when he was pushed out, the board had agreed to give him a $200,000 severance salary for a year after he was fired. He had always been careless with money, taking it in with one hand and handing out with the other, so he set off to live life and wait for the right opportunity to present itself. He fell in love with a ballet dancer in San Francisco, a relationship that soon ended. Then he visited his friends and family in St. Louis before traveling to New York to get his regular haircut and favorite cappuccino and wandered through the Ernest Sohn jeans store. And then, finally, Jack found what he was looking for. On a return trip to St. Louis, he met up with his old friend Jim McKelvey, and they started to discuss ideas for a new business they could start together. Jim blew glass for a living and made elaborate glass art sculptures that he sold to stores and collectors. He told Jack that one afternoon he had missed out on the sale of a large glass sculpture because his customer didn't have enough cash. They started to discuss a product that would allow people to make such a purchase using a cell phone and a credit card, and got to work on an idea they would first call Squirrel, then rename Square. Jack had another side project too, revenge. Unlike Noah, who was doing his best to forget and forgive the betrayal by his friends, Jack ran in the opposite direction, unable to flush the resentment he felt toward Ev, the board, and now Biz too, out of his mind. Jack began obsessing over every news article, blog post, and status update about Twitter. Each time he read an article where Jack Dorsey wasn't acknowledged as the creator of Twitter, his blood temperature rose a degree. Each time a celebrity tweeted that they were visiting Twitter's offices, and Jack wasn't there to meet them, his wounds deepened. Ego affected them all, Noah, Jack, Ev, and Biz. They were all driven by it. For Noah, ego became a tool for reflection, for trying to understand whom he had wronged in the past, and how he could be a better person in the future. For Jack, it had the opposite effect, causing him to obsess over who had wronged him in the past, and how he could return to the spotlight in the future. And what better way to achieve this goal than to eclipse other people's egos? Although Jack didn't have a say in the daily operations of the company, he chose to accept any press request that came into his personal Twitter email address, which he was allowed to keep as a silent board member. He started to meet with reporters and bloggers, and sometimes narrated a story about the invention of Twitter that excluded everyone else's role from the history of the company. No mention of Noah, Biz, Jeremy, Crystal, Blaine, Florian, Jeremy, or Tim. No mention of the other people in the room when Twitter was created, or their role in the brainstorming sessions at breakfast, lunches, dinners, and the hack days. And certainly no mention of Ev. While Jack had the germ of the idea of people sharing their status, without Audio the idea would have remained just that, an idea. It was Noah's determination to save Audio that brought Jack's status concept to a group of people who brainstormed during the hack days and could execute it. Without Noah's vision of a service that could connect people who felt alone and a name that people would remember, Twitter would never exist. It was Ev who insisted on making Twitter about what's happening. And without Ev's financial support and Silicon Valley fame, Twitter would never have grown as rapidly as it did. And without Biz's ethical stance on protecting and standing up for people who use the service, Twitter would be a very different company. Most of all, without the dozens of dedicated Twitter employees building and developing new ideas and keeping the site alive, the startup might have failed like so many others. But Jack told a very different story. He had started to develop a creation myth. The Marathon Man. A few months had passed since Jack had attended his first board meeting as silent chairman. But each session was still the same, as he sat deliberately glaring at Ev. For Ev was slightly different. He had become efficient at ignoring Jack's stare, as had Fred, Bidgen, and Goldman. But there was a new person in the room who was confused by the spectacle. Peter Fenton, or Fenton as he was called, was the newest member of the Twitter board and its latest investor. He had arrived at his first board meeting in early 2009 with the excitement of a child on Christmas morning. Becoming an investor in Twitter had been one of the biggest challenges of his career so far, and here he was, finally a part of the company. It took about 10 minutes for Fenton to realize there were no presents under the tree and something was seriously amiss at Twitter. He had been obsessing about the company for months. In January 2009, he caught wind that Twitter was about to raise its third round of financing. But the investment company Fenton worked for, Benchmark Capital, wasn't going to be part of this funding. Fenton was 36 years old at the time and already worth tens of millions of dollars. He looked like a Marine, with short light hair and a rigidly straight posture. As was the case for most venture capitalists in the Valley, it wasn't about the money for him. It was about winning. Fenton had to be the best at everything he did. Marathons, venture capital, learning to fly helicopters. To ensure he was involved in Twitter's next round of investing, he pulled strings, pushed people, wined and dined Ev and Biz at Fenton's home in the affluent area of San Francisco nicknamed Billionaires Row, and eventually, through sheer determination, became the lead investor in the company's new round of financing, depositing $21 million that would value Twitter at more than $250 million. On February 13th, 2009, Biz announced a new funding in a blog post that said, "Twitter is growing at a phenomenal rate. Active users have increased 900% in a year." Missing from the post were the revenue numbers, which had increased by 0% since the company began. Still sitting at $0. Ev had fully taken charge of Twitter at this point. And although there were still just under 30 full-time employees of the company, he had started to fend off the endless outages and other problems that had plagued Twitter in the past. Monetization was about to start moving up on the priority list. In January, Ev had hired Kevin now as Twitter's Director of Mobile Business Development, with the task of developing partnerships and finally making money. Ev had also forged a collaboration with Current TV, the television company run by Al Gore, which would display tweets over live video during Barack Obama's presidential inauguration. While Ev was trying to fix the internals of the Blue Bird, Biz, who was the most gregarious employee at the company, had become the official public face of Twitter. He had started traveling around the country spreading the Twitter gospel at conferences, going on talk shows, including the Colbert Report, and doing hundreds of magazine and newspaper interviews. But there was also now a new unofficial public face of Twitter. Jack had started work on Square, his mobile payments company, and settled into a new sparse and sleek apartment in Mint Plaza, just off 5th Street. Though small, his new home was minimalist and appealed to Jack's sterile sense. The floors were as flat and shiny as an ice skating rink. The walls blank. To the ire of Ev and Biz, Jack had continued to take interviews with anyone who requested to talk to him. Newspapers, blogs, television outlets. Worse, Jack was beginning to sell the world on a story that he was still involved in Twitter in a day-to-day role, talking about new features the site had launched as if he were associated with their development, even though he didn't even have a desk at the company's offices. Rather than argue with Jack about his media blitz, Ev tried to solve the problem by including Jack in events. In early January 2009, Biz, Ev, and Jack had shared the stage at the Crunchies, an annual competition, an award ceremony for tech companies. Given Twitter's unfathomable rise in popularity at the time, the three co-founders had won the award for Best Startup Founders. They took turns walking to the microphone and addressing the audience. Biz, who spoke first, thanked Jack and Ev for being an inspiration to him. Ev, second up, thanked Jack and Biz, who stood behind him on the stage. "This has really been a team effort, and this should really be for the entire team," Ev said with the award in his hand. "Always try to give credit where it was due. We have 26 people back at Twitter HQ who worked their asses off." Jack, last up, solemnly thanked the millions of people who used the service. "You're changing the world 140 characters at a time," Jack said in a monotone voice. Then they all walked off stage. Before becoming an investor, like most of the people in the audience at the Crunchies, Fenton had believed Jack had more of a day-to-day role at Twitter. Yet after the board meeting concluded, a sickening tension lingering in the room, Fenton was in mild shock. Back at his office, he picked up the phone and called Bidgen. "What the fuck was that all about?" he asked. "You mean you didn't know?" Bidgen said, Know what? Bidgen dove in, telling Fenton everything. That Jack had been kicked out of the company and why. That Ev had taken over and why. And that, in case he hadn't noticed, the two co-founders had a deep-seated dislike for each other. I feel like I just walked into the conference room and there's blood all over the wall, Fenton said after hearing the story. He put the phone down and called Jack, asking him to meet for dinner. Jack suggested Chez Papa near his apartment. As they sat in the darkened restaurant amid the chatter of patrons, Jack told Fenton his side of the story. That had pushed him out for power and control, and that Twitter had been Jack's idea. And he complained about the new direction of the company. Ev had been busy since Jack left, making lots of changes to the site and the service. He had wasted no time discontinuing many of the text messaging partnerships that Jack had set up during his tenure as CEO. Jack, who believed Twitter should work predominantly over SMS, complained to Fenton about this too. Ev this, Ev that. Fenton was incensed. His mouth was agape. Impassioned. He slammed his hand on the table and made Jack a promise he planned to keep. I will not rest until you're back in that company, Fenton said, as he spiraled into a passionate tirade. For the first time in months, Jack felt a sense of elation as he had finally recruited someone to his side. You are the founder of this company, Fenton said, his hand trumpeting the table. I will not rest until you're back at Twitter. Dinner with Al. Ev and Biz looked at each other and shrugged as they were directed to the St. Regis Hotel. They walked past a rectangular modern fireplace, then left, then right, through the doors, down a hallway, finally coming upon a semi-private elevator, where they were directed inside. Okay, I got this, Biz said as the elevator doors closed behind the two of them. We are going for dinner with the former Vice President of the United States. He was clearly excited. Ev smirked as they rose to the hotel to its upper floors. They were dressed in their usual outfits, jeans, sweaters, jackets, and sneakers. The elevator finally came to stop, and they emerged into a relatively dark hallway with deep beige walls and a plain maroon carpet. Dim lighting gave the hall the ambience of a hip nightclub. I guess this is it, Biz said, tapping lightly on the door of a suite. They stood waiting for a few seconds, unsure what to do next, then heard footsteps approaching and a deep southern voice bellow from inside. Hey guys, come on in, Al Gore said as the door swung open and he waved them inside the extravagant apartment he owned atop one of the most luxurious hotels in San Francisco. Welcome. Hey Al, Biz said, slapping his hand into a shake, even though he had barely spoken to the former vice president before. Ev, a little more austere in his manner, shook Gore's hand and greeted him more formally. Hello, Mr. Gore. It's nice to see you. It was March 2009, and Gore was running Current TV, the television network he had purchased after his semi-failed presidential bid, and he had invited Ev and Biz to dinner at his San Francisco home to discuss how Twitter and Current TV could work together. As Ev and Biz took in a large, ornate space, Gore introduced them to the two other people in the room, one of whom was Joel Hyatt, Current TV's co-founder. Let me get you boys a drink, Gore bellowed as he directed them inside. We have everything. Whiskey, beer, wine, champagne, he asked, then paused, peering back at them, his eyes popping open a little. Shots, he said, followed by a deep vice presidential laughter. Biz had never been taken by celebrities. A-B-C- and Z-listers were of equal importance, and in most instances, to Biz the rich and famous were far less impressive than someone who got up each day and toiled in a blue-collar job. But Al Gore was different. Biz had been bursting with excitement to spend time with him. Like Biz, Gore had a great passion for the environment and animals. And they had one other thing in common. They both disliked George W. Bush. The relationship between Current TV and Twitter had started to tighten in 2008, when they had joined forces to create an experimental version of the presidential debates. The idea, called Hack the Debate, allowed people to tweet opinions about the presidential candidates that Current TV would then layer on top of live television. Although the misses people were sharing on Twitter were being referenced by mainstream news outlets, including CNN and MSNBC, Current TV had envisioned an entirely new way of creating interactive live television. almost merging the two mediums. After the debates had concluded, and Barack Obama had tweeted about winning the 2008 presidential election, Gore immediately saw how compelling the combination had been. People making fun of Sarah Palin in real time, debunking false statements by both candidates, rooting for their home team. Current TV was determined to develop a stronger bond with the future of media. Twitter, like most high-level politicians, Gore had more charisma and charm than a Hollywood star. He told jokes and shared dramatic stories about his time as vice president. He talked about how he had wrangled current from a French conglomerate by pulling lots of strings and calling in lots of favors. We had to hold some metaphorical guns to some metaphorical heads, Gore said with a chuckle. Then Joel, his business partner, chimed in. Al, the heads were real, followed by a roar of laughter. More wine was poured, then more. Before they knew it, Ev and Biz were getting sloppy drunk with the former vice president of the United States. Biz beamed at Gore and spoke to him as if they were old drinking buddies in a shabby Boston pub. Al this and Al that, followed by more jokes. He was smitten. Ev was having fun too. But upon noticing Biz's excitement, he decided to head off what was surely coming next from Gore and his executives. Just so you know, Ev said, interrupting the group. Biz gets very excited and may very well come up with a plan about how we can all work together. But I want to preface that this is just him being excited. Then, sobering up for a brief moment, he added, we're not necessarily agreeing to anything. At this point in Twitter's life, Ed had been through dozens of acquisition attempts by celebrities who had asked to meet just to talk and then pitched him on a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to partner up, all for the low price of an ownership stake in Twitter. Celebrities wanted equity in Twitter in exchange for using the service. It had happened before with Ashton Kutcher, the actor-turned-entrepreneur, who had invited Ev and Biz down to his house in L.A. to talk. There, by the pool at Kutcher's house, with his wife, Demi Moore, sitting close by, Kutcher had pitched him on ownership of the company. Sean Puffy Combs, the rapper, had also tried to negotiate an ownership deal with Ev. Each time, Ev had politely responded, telling the rich and famous, who were never told no. No, it happened with CEOs too. At a dinner at Bill Gates' multimillion-dollar house in Seattle, Steve Ballmer, the chief of Microsoft, told Ev if he ever wanted to sell the company, Microsoft would be very interested. Ev politely declined Ballmer. For Ev, it was never about the money or the celebrities. It always went back to Ev's vision of building something that gave people from nowhere, like, say, Clark's, Nebraska, the same equal voice as those from somewhere. Now it was Al Gore's turn to try to get some of the bluebird's feathers. Listen, boys, Gore said, as he began presenting some ideas, including the concept that they team up to create a company called Twitter TV. It would be a sort of merger of the two companies. Gore said that Twitter and current TV could build the future of television, that together they would take Twitter beyond just being a layer on top of TV, and create an entirely new interactive experience in the living room. Gore was very convincing. The arrangement would likely give him a large ownership stake in Twitter. Ev opened his mouth to politely turn down the offer, but Biz drunkenly interrupted. Al, I think you're totally right, Biz slurred. But if you're right, and I believe you are, why would we lock ourselves in with just you? Why wouldn't we do what you're asking with every TV channel out there? Gore paused for a moment before making an impassioned argument. It was persuasive, but not compelling enough for Ev and Biz. Ev politely said that they would give it some thought. Take it back to the company. Sleep on it. As the dinner wrapped up, Gore wasn't giving up. He emerged from the kitchen with a bottle of Patron tequila and a handful of shot glasses. They tell me this is the good stuff, he said with loud laughter. Shots were poured, and soon they were swishing vice presidential Patron back with the wine. Ev said it was probably time to go. Thanks so much for dinner and everything, he told Gore. We'll be in touch soon. Ev and Biz walked to the elevator, rode down to the lobby, and sat in the hotel bar, sipping more drinks and trying to decompress from a meeting. Holy shit, Biz said as he almost fell out of his chair, wasted. We just got drunk with the guy who was almost a fucking president. But it didn't take long for them to realize their answer was once again going to be no. They were determined to keep Twitter independent. We gotta stop doing these meetings with famous people. Ev said, they keep trying to buy us.